This is Lecture 1 of The Human Being, His Destiny and World Evolution, a cycle of 6 lectures given by Rudolf Steiner in Christiania, Oslo, May 16th through the 21st, 1923. Lecture 1. In the course of this short cycle, I should like to set forth several things connected in the most intensive way with the being of man, the formation of man's destiny, and what might be called the relationship of man in his entirety to world evolution. I shall proceed immediately to the center of this matter by pointing out that the whole evolution of man's being within the realm of earth life is connected not only with what we observe with our ordinary waking consciousness while participating in earth life, but is also connected closely and intensively with what takes place during sleep, from the time of falling asleep until awaking. Doubtless, external earthly culture, external earthly civilization derives its significance primarily from that which man is able to think, feel, and accomplish out of his waking being. Man, however, would be utterly powerless in an external sense unless his human forces were continuously renewed in the period between falling asleep and awaking by contact with the spiritual world. Our spirit and soul being, or as we usually call it in anthroposophy, our astral body and our ego, withdraw from the physical and etheric body when man falls asleep. They enter the spiritual world, penetrating the physical and etheric body again only after awaking. Thus, if, leading a normal life, we spend 1/3 of our earthly existence in the sleeping state, let me read that again. Thus, if leading a normal life, we spend 1/3 of our earthly existence in the sleeping state. If we look back on our earth life, we always join day to day. We leave out of this conscious retrospect all that we experience between falling asleep and awaking. We skip, as it were, all the things contributed by the heavenly realms, by the divine worlds, to our earth life. And we take into account only what is given us by earthly experiences. Yet, if we desire to attain correct conceptions of our experiences between falling asleep and awaking, we should not spurn ideas which diverge from those of ordinary life. It would be naive to assume that the same things occur in the divine spiritual worlds that are occurring in the physical sensible worlds, wherein we dwell between awaking and falling asleep. For on falling asleep, we return to the spiritual worlds, and here things are quite different from things in the physical sensible world. All this must be taken into account most decidedly by anyone wishing to form a conception of man's supersensible destinies. In mankind's religious records, we find many strange allusions which can be understood only if penetrated by means of spiritual science. Thus a passage occurs in the Bible, which, although known to everybody, is generally too little regarded. "Unless ye become as little children, ye may not enter the kingdom of God." Often such passages are interpreted most trivially. Nonetheless, they are always intended to convey an extraordinarily deep meaning. The knowledge from which is drawn a conception of the spiritual, supersensible, has often been called by me, as well as by others, the science of initiation. We speak of this science of initiation when we look back at what went on in mankind's ancient mysteries. Yet we also speak of the science of initiation, modern science of initiation, if we wish to characterize anthroposophy in its deeper aspects. Science of initiation points, as it were, to the knowledge of primeval conditions, of original conditions. We seek to acquire knowledge concerning that which existed in the beginning, which marked the starting point. All these endeavors are connected with a matter of yet greater profundity, which presently will be envisaged by our souls. If we have fallen asleep on May 16th, 1923, and have slept until May 17th, 1923, we assume that this time has been spent by us in the same way as by a person who happens to stay awake and roam all night long through the streets of some city. We somehow picture to ourselves the experiences of our spirit and soul, ego and astral body during the night, as though similar to the experiences, although in a somewhat different state, of a reveler seeking nightly adventures. Things, however, are not as they seem to us. one must consider that on falling asleep in the evening, or even in the daytime, it really does not matter when, but I want first to discuss the nightly sleep enjoyed by every respectable person, one invariably goes back in time until a phase of life is reached lying at the very beginning of one's earthly existence. Moreover, one goes back even beyond one's earthly existence to pre-earthly life, to that world from which we descended after acquiring a physical body by means of conception. At the moment of falling asleep, we are transported backward through the whole course of time. We are brought back to that moment when we descended from the heavenly realms to earth. Hence, if we fall asleep, for instance, on May 16th, 1923, we are transplanted from this date to that period which preceded our descent to earth, and also to that time which we cannot remember because our memory stops at a certain point of our childhood. Each night, if we pass through it in real sleep, we actually become children again with regard to spirit and soul. And just as we can walk in the physical world for 2 or 3 miles through space, so a person can walk at the age of 20 through time for a span of 20 years, thus arriving at a stage before he was a child, when he began to be a human being. We return across time to the starting point of our earth life. Hence, while the physical and etheric body are lying in bed, the ego and astral body have gone back across time to an earlier moment. Now the question arises, if we go back every night to an earlier moment, what happens to our ego and astral body while we are awake? We would not ask such a question unless being aware of this nightly going backward. And at bottom, even this going backward is only an illusion. In reality, our ego and astral body have not emerged, even during our waking daytime consciousness, from the state in which we existed during our pre-earthly existence. If we desire to recognize the truth about these facts, we must grasp the idea that ego and astral body have, initially, no share in our earthly evolution. They remain behind. They stop at the point where we began to acquire a physical and an etheric body. We, thus, even when waking, leave our ego and astral body at the point marking the beginning of our earth life. Fundamentally, we live our earth life only with the physical body, and in a certain way with the etheric body. Our physical body alone becomes old. As for the etheric body, it connects our beginning with that moment at which we happen to stand during a certain period. Let us suppose that someone was born in 1900. His ego and astral body have come to a standstill at the moment of his birth. The physical body has reached the age of 23, and the etheric body connects the moment at which this person entered earth life with the moment experienced by him as the present one. Hence, if we did not possess an etheric body, we would awaken every morning as a newborn babe. Only by entering the etheric body before entering the physical body do we accommodate ourselves to the physical body's actual age. This accommodation must take place every morning. The etheric body is the mediator between the spirit-soul element and the physical body. It is a mediator, forming the connecting link across the years of life. If a man reaches 60 or more years of life, the etheric body still forms the link between his very first appearance on earth, the point at which his ego and astral body have remained, and the age of his physical body. Now, you will say, well, after all, the ego is ours. It has aged with us. So also has our astral body aged with us, our thinking, feeling, and willing. If someone has become 60, then his ego too has become 60. This would be quite correct if our everyday ego and our real ego were identical. Our everyday ego, however, is not the same as our real ego. That remains standing at the starting point of our earth life. Our physical body reaches, let us say, the age of 60. By means of the mediation of the etheric body, the physical body reflects, corresponding to the respective moment at which it is living, the mirrored image of the real ego. And what we see is the mirrored image of the real ego reflected back to us from moment to moment by the physical body, but resulting from something that has not accompanied us into earth life. This mirrored image we call our ego. This mirrored image will naturally grow older as the reflecting apparatus, the physical body, gradually loses the freshness of early childhood and finally becomes wobbly and unstable. Yet this ego, in quotes, which is only the mirrored image of the real ego, appears to age for the sole reason that the reflecting apparatus functions less efficiently after the physical body has grown old. Like a perspective, the etheric body stretches from the present moment to the real ego and astral body, both of which do not descend into the physical world. You can imagine that these facts shaping human earth life must acquire a special significance at the moment of human death. The physical body is the first that we discard in death. This body, however, is the one that determines our earthly age. In discarding this body, what do we retain? Primarily that which we have not carried with us into earth life, but which we have filled with all the experiences of earth life, the ego and astral body. They have, as it were, stood still at the starting point, yet they have always looked at that which the physical body, helped by the etheric body, has reflected back as a mirrored image. Thus, in passing through the portal of death, we stand at our life's starting point, not filled, however, with what we carried within us when descending from the spiritual world, but filled with what was reflected back to us during earth life as the mirrored image of this earth life. With that we are filled to the brim, and this fact engenders an especial state of consciousness at the end of earth life. This especial state of consciousness at the end of earth life can be comprehended only by someone who, endowed with imaginative, inspired, and intuitive knowledge, is able to see that which generally remains unconscious, that which man experiences between falling asleep and awaking. Then one recognizes how man during every night retraces the life of the past day. One person does it faster, another slower, in 1 minute or 5 minutes. Concerning these things, however, time conditions are entirely different from those of ordinary outward earth life. If we are gifted with supersensible knowledge, we may take a look at what is experienced by the ego and the astral body. You may then actually, by going backward, recapitulate what you have experienced in the physical world since waking up in the morning. Every night we repeat the experiences of the day in reverse order. Every night we first recapitulate the experiences we had just before going to sleep, then the preceding hours, then those lying back still further, and so forth. Having passed in review, in reverse order, all the day's events, we usually awaken after arriving at the moment when we started in the morning. You might make the following objection: but people are sometimes awakened by a sudden noise. You must consider, however, that time may elapse in different ways. For instance, someone goes to bed at 11 in the evening, sleeps quietly until 3 in the morning, and having recapitulated in reverse order all that he experienced during the past day until 10 in the morning, is roused by a sudden disturbance. In such a case, the rest of the time can be retraced very rapidly in the last few moments before waking. Thus, events that have stretched themselves out over several hours may, in such a case, be passed through again almost instantly. The conditions of time change in the sleeping state. Time may be completely compressed. Hence we may truthfully say that the human being during every period of sleep passes through, in reverse, what he has experienced during his last waking period. He recapitulates the events not only by seeing them before him, but also by interweaving his experiences with a complete moral judgment of what he did during the day. The human being, as it were, is summoned to judge his own state of morality. And when, on awaking, we have finished this activity, we have passed something like a world judgment on our worth as human beings. Every morning, having experienced in reverse what we did during the day, we appraise ourselves as a being of greater or lesser worth. This description conveys to you what man's spirit and soul element undergoes unconsciously during every night. That is, during 1/3 of our earth life, if spent in a normal way. The soul passes through life in reverse, only somewhat faster, because merely 1/3 of our earth life is taken up by sleep. After our physical body has been discarded in death, the part called by me in my writings etheric body or formative force body gradually separates itself from the ego and the astral body. This separation takes place in such manner that the human being, having passed through the portal of death, feels his thoughts, heretofore considered by him as something inward, becoming realities which acquire ever greater expansion. 2, 3, or 4 days after his death, man has this feeling: fundamentally I consist of nothing but thoughts. These thoughts, however, are driven asunder. The human being as a thought being takes on ever greater dimensions, and finally this whole human thought being is dissolved into the cosmos. But the more this thought being, that is the etheric body, is dissolved into the cosmos, the more arise experiences derived from other sources than ordinary consciousness. Essentially all that we have thought and visualized in the waking state is scattered 3 days after death. This fact cannot be evaded by hiding our heads in the sand. The content of conscious earth life has vanished 3 days after death. But just because the things seemingly so important, so essential during earth life are dissipated within 3 days, there arise from the depth memories of that which could not come forth until now, memories of what we always experienced at night in a preliminary way, between falling asleep and awaking. As the waking life of the day is scattered, dissipated, our inward depth sends forth the sum of experiences undergone by us during the night. These are none other than our daytime experiences, but passed through in reverse order and acquired in every detail by means of our moral sense. Let me read that again. These are none other than our daytime experiences, but passed through in reverse order and acquired in every detail by means of our moral sense. You must remember that our real ego and our real astral body are still standing at life's beginning, whereas the mirrored images that we have received from the physical body, regardless of its age, now flutter away with the etheric body. What we have not looked at in the least during earth life, our nightly experiences, now come forth as a new content. Therefore, we do not really feel as if our earth life were ended until 3 days have passed and brought about the scattering of our etheric body. If someone dies, let us say on May 16, 1923, he seems to be carried to the end of his earth life by the arising from nocturnal darkness of his nightly experiences. At the same time, he is seized by the tendency to go backward. Hence we pass again through the period spent by us, night in, night out, in the state of sleep. This amounts to about 1/3 of our earth life. The different religions describe this stage of existence as purgatory, kamaloka, and so forth. We pass through our earth life just as we passed through it unconsciously in successive nights, until our experiences have gone back to its very beginning. The wheel of life, ever rotating, must again return to its starting point. Such is the course of events. 3 days after death, our daytime experiences have fluttered away. 1/3 of our earth life has been passed through in reverse, a period during which we can evaluate in full consciousness our human worth. For what we have passed through every night unconsciously rises into full consciousness once the etheric body has been discarded. In ordinary life, we can conceive only of paths leading through space. Space, however, has no significance for the spirit and soul element. It is significant only for the physical sensible. When reaching the spirit and soul state, we must also conceive of paths leading through time. After death, we must go backward across the whole span of time traversed by our physical body since breaking away, as might be said, from the heavenly realms. Actually, we go back thrice as fast, because the time is balanced through the experiences undergone by us every night. Thus, we return anew to the starting point. but enriched by all that we experienced as physical beings, enriched not only by what remains as a memory, for what flew away with the etheric body still remains as a memory, but also by the judgment passed unconsciously each night out of our full human nature on our worth as human beings. Thus, depending on the kind of life lived by us, we sooner or later enter again, approximately after several decades, into the spiritual world whence we had departed, but departed only inasmuch as our consciousness was concerned. Actually, we have stood still at the starting point, waiting until the physical body's earthly course would have been fulfilled, so that we might return again to what we were before birth, respectively before conception. In describing these things, especially in public, we must beware lest people be shocked by such unusual concepts. Speaking metaphorically, it could be said that we advance after death. In reality, however, we retrace our steps after death. We live our life in reverse. Time, as it rotates, returns to its starting point. The following might be said: the divine world remains where it stood at the beginning. Man but bursts out, wanders out of the divine world. Then he comes back to it, bringing with him all that he conquered while dwelling outside of the divine realms. Then in its turn comes life. After returning once more to the spiritual world, enriched not only by conscious but also by unconscious earth life, after quote-unquote becoming as little children, who stand again within the heavenly realms, we pass into a kind of life that might be described in this way. Now the human being beholds what he really is. Just as he perceived with his ordinary consciousness the plants, stones, and animals among whom he dwelt on earth, so he now perceives his new surroundings. What I am describing is the life after death. Here man sees himself surrounded by human souls, who, having died or not yet having been born, undergo no earthly experiences, but those of the divine world. Moreover, he perceives the higher hierarchies, such as the angels, the archangels, the exousiae, and others still higher. You know these names and their significance from my occult science. The human being gathers experiences in this purely spiritual world. I could characterize these experiences by saying it is as if the human being were carrying his own being into the cosmos. What he experienced during the waking earth life, during the nightly unconscious earth life, he now carries into the cosmos. It is needed by the cosmos. While standing amidst earth life, we judge the whole surrounding cosmos, sun, moon, and stars, only from a terrestrial viewpoint. As astronomers, we calculate the movement of the sun, of the planets, the latter's relationship to the fixed stars, and so forth. This entire astronomical scientific method, however, could be compared to the following procedure. Suppose that a man stood here and a tiny being, for instance a ladybug, observed him. Then this tiny creature would found a science, and, quote, Association of Ladybugs for the Study of Mankind, unquote, would observe how man comes to life. Parenthesis, I presume that ladybugs too have a certain lifespan. Parenthesis. This association would observe what happened to man, would investigate all the phenomena backwards and forwards. One thing, however, would be ignored, that the human being eats and drinks, thus renewing his physical being again and again. The ladybugs would believe that man is born, grows by himself, and dies by himself. They would not be able to recognize that man's metabolism must be renewed from day to day. As an astronomer, the human being behaves somewhat similarly in regard to the world. He pays no attention to the fact that the world is a gigantic organism which needs nourishment. Otherwise, would the stars long ago be scattered in all the directions of universal space, and the planets would have deserted their orbits. This gigantic organism, in order to live, needs a kind of nourishment that must be received again and again. Whence comes this nourishment? Here we encounter the great questions concerning man's relationship to the universe. It is simply stupendous how much physical science can prove. Only, somehow or other, these proofs have little meaning. People who have been told that anthroposophy contradicts ordinary science in many things are inclined to believe that this ordinary science can prove anything in the world. This is true and not denied by anthroposophy. Science can prove anything in the world. Only things happen to be constituted in such a way that in certain cases these proofs have nothing to do with reality. Let us suppose that I could calculate how the physical structure of the human heart changes from one year to the next. Then we might say a man of 33 will have such and such a heart structure. At 34 he will have a certain heart structure. At 35 he will have still another heart structure, and so forth. Having made these observations over a period of 5 years, I calculate how the heart structure of this man was constituted, let us say 30 years ago. This can be done. Now the whole physical structure of the heart lies before me. I can also calculate how it was constituted 300 years ago. Here, however, arises a slight difficulty. 300 years ago this heart did not exist, and could therefore have had no physical structure of any kind. The calculation was absolutely correct. We can prove that the heart was constituted 300 years ago in such and such a way, only it did not exist. We can also prove that the heart will be constituted 300 years later in such and such a way, only then it will have ceased to exist. But the proofs are completely infallible. Geology can be handled today in the same manner. We can calculate that a certain layer of the soil indicates this or that fact. Likewise, we calculate how everything was 20 millions of years ago, or will be 20 millions of years later. The proof clicks with marvelous accuracy. Only the earth did not exist 20 millions of years ago. It is the same as with the heart. Neither is the earth going to exist 20 millions of years later. The proofs are flawless, but have nothing whatever to do with reality. This is how things actually are. The possibilities of being deceived by physical life are immeasurably great. We must be able to penetrate spiritual life if we desire to gain a standpoint from which the physical world can be judged. And now let us go back to that which was to be elucidated by this digression concerning proofs that have no point of contact with reality. Let us go back to the moment after death, as I characterized it, and observe how the human being adjusts his life to the world of spiritual facts, spiritual beings. He brings into the spiritual world what he has experienced on earth while waking and sleeping. Just consider that these experiences are the nourishment of the cosmos, that they are continuously needed by the cosmos in order to live on. Whatever we experience on earth in the course of an easy or hard life is carried by us into the cosmos after death. We thus feel how our being as man is dissolved into the cosmos to furnish its nourishment. These experiences undergone by man between death and a new birth are of overwhelming grandeur, of immeasurable loftiness. Then comes the moment when man appears to himself no longer as a unity, but as a multiplicity. He appears to himself as if some of his virtues and qualities moved, as it were, toward one star, others toward a different star. Now man perceives how his being is scattered out into the whole world. He also perceives how the parts of his being fight with one another, harmonize with one another, disharmonize with one another. Man feels how that which he experienced on earth by day or by night is scattered into the cosmos. And just as we held fast to our nightly experiences when 3 days after death our thoughts, that is the essence of our waking life, dissipated out into the cosmos, and we, concentrating on our nightly experiences, lived again over, but backward, our whole earth life, until the starting point of our earth life is reached. So now, when our entire earthly human experience is scattered out into the cosmos, we hold fast to that which we represent as human beings, belonging to a supersensible world order. Now our real ego emerges from what might be called the Dionysically disjointed human being. Gradually there emerges the consciousness, you are nothing but spirit. You have only dwelt in a physical body, have only passed through, even in the nightly experiences, the events brought upon you by the physical body. You are a spirit among spirits. Now we enter a spiritual existence among spiritual beings. whereas our substance as physical man is scattered and dissolved into the cosmos. What we passed through here on earth is divided and given to the cosmos, so that it might nourish the cosmos and enable it to live on, so that the cosmos might receive new incentives for the movement of its stars, the sustenance of its stars. As we must partake of physical nourishment in order to live as physical men between birth and death, so must the cosmos partake of human experiences, take them into itself. Thus we feel ourselves more and more as cosmic men, find our whole being transfused, as it were, into the cosmos, but a cosmos taken in a spiritual sense. And then the moment approaches when we must seek the transition from death to a new birth, from man become cosmos to cosmos become man. We have ascended by identifying ourselves more and more with the cosmos. A moment comes, I have called it in my mystery plays, the great midnight hour of existence, which brings to us this feeling. We must again become human beings. What we carried into the cosmos must be returned to us by the cosmos, so that we may come back to earth. Today it was my foremost purpose to describe man's being as it is carried out of earth life into the vast cosmic space. Thus this sketch, which will be enlarged upon during the coming days, has placed us into the center of life between death and a new birth. The end of Lecture 1. This is Lecture 2 of Man's Being, His Destiny and World Evolution, 6 lectures given in Christiania, which became Oslo, May 16th to the 21st, 1923. Yesterday I tried to give you a picture of the states undergone by the human being after he passes through the portal of death and arrives in the spiritual world. Let us briefly summon before our soul the picture of the most essential stages. Immediately after passing through the portal of death, the human being first experiences the withdrawing of his ideational world. The ideas, the powers of thought become objects, become something like active forces spreading out into the universe. Thus man feels at first the withdrawal from him of all the experiences he has consciously undergone during his earth life between birth and death. But whereas earth life, as experienced through thinking, withdraws from the human being and goes out into the vast cosmos, a process that occurs a few days after death, see Rudolf Steiner, Theosophy, man's inner depths send forth a consciousness of all that he has undergone unconsciously during earth life while asleep. This stage takes shape in such a way that he goes backward and recapitulates his earth life in a period of 1/3 of its actual duration. During this time, the human being is intensely wrapped up in his own self. It might be said that he is still intensely connected with his own earthly affairs. He is thoroughly interwoven with what he passed through while asleep during the successive nights of his earthly life. You will realize that the human being, while continuously occupied with his nightly experiences, must necessarily be led back to his self. Just consider the dreams, the only element in man's earth life that surges up from the sleeping state. These dreams are the least part of his experiences while asleep. Everything else, however, remains unconscious. Only the dreams surge up into consciousness. Yet it could be said that the dreams, be they ever so interesting, ever so manifold, ever so rich in many-hued colors, represent something that restricts the human being completely to his own self. If a number of persons sleep in the same room, each of them has nevertheless his own dream world. And when they tell their dreams to one another, these persons will speak of things that seem to have happened in entirely different worlds. For in sleep each person is alone with himself, and only by inserting our will into our organism do we occupy the same world situated in the same space as is occupied by others. If we were always asleep, each of us would live in a world of his own. But this world of our own, which we pass through every night between falling asleep and awaking, is the world we pass through in reverse after death, during a period encompassing 1/3 of our lifespan. If people possessed nothing but this world, they would be occupied for 2 or 3 decades after death, if they died in old age, exclusively with themselves. This, however, is not the case. What we experience as our own affairs nevertheless connects us with the whole world. For the world through which each of us passes by himself is interwoven with relations to all those human beings with whom we were associated in life. This interweaving of relations is caused by the fact that when looking down from the soul world on the earthly experiences of those persons with whom we were associated in some way, we experience together with them what occurs on earth. Hence, anyone willing to try may perceive, if he acquaints himself with spiritual scientific methods, see Rudolf Steiner, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and its Attainment, how the dead, immediately after their transition, are helped to participate intensively in earthly events by those of their former companions who are still alive. And so we find that the dead, in the measure in which they shared this or that interest with others, underwent common destinies with others, remain connected with all these earthly interests, are still interested in earthly events. And, being no longer hindered by the physical body, they judge earthly events much more lucidly and sagaciously than men who are still alive. By attaining a conscious relation to the dead, we are enabled to gain, by means of their judgment, an extraordinary lucidity concerning earthly events. Furthermore, something else must be considered. We can see that certain things existing within earthly relations will be preserved in the spiritual world. Thus an eternal element is intermingled, as it were, with our terrestrial experiences. Descriptions of the spiritual world often sound almost absurd. Nonetheless, since I am addressing myself presumably to anthroposophists of long standing, I may venture to speak frankly of these matters. In looking for a way to communicate with the dead, it is even possible to use earthly words, ask questions, and receive answers. And now a particular fact is to be noticed. The ability lost first by the dead is that of using nouns, whereas verbs are retained by them for a long time. Their favorite forms of expression, however, are exclamatory words, all that is connected with emotion and heart, and "oh" and "ah," as expressions of amazement, of surprise, and so forth, are often used by the dead in their language. We must, as it were, first learn the language of the dead. These things are not at all as the Spiritists imagine. These people believe that they can communicate with the dead by means of a medium in ordinary earthly language. The character of these communications immediately indicates that we are concerned here with subconscious states of living persons, and not with actual direct utterances of the dead transmitted through a medium. For the dead outgrow ordinary human language by degrees. After the passing of several years, we can communicate with the dead only by acquiring their language, which can best be done by suggesting through simple symbolic drawings what we want to express. Then the answers will be given by means of similar symbolic forms, necessarily received by us in shadowy outlines. All this is described by me for the purpose of indicating that the dead, although dwelling in an element akin to sleep, yet have a vast range of interests and sweep the whole world with their glance. And we ourselves can greatly assist them. This may be done by thinking of the dead as vividly as possible, especially by sending thoughts to them which bring to life in the most striking way what we experienced in their company. Abstract concepts are not understood by the dead. Hence I must send out such thoughts as the following. Here's the road between Christiania and a nearby place. Here we two walked together. The other person who is now dead walked at my side. I can still hear him speaking. I hear the sound of his voice. I try to recall how he moved his arms, how he moved his head. By visualizing as vividly as possible what we experienced together with the dead, by sending out our thoughts to the dead, whom we conjure up before our soul in a familiar image, we can make these thoughts, as it were, soar or stream toward the dead. Thus we provide the dead with something like a window through which they can look at the world, Not only the thought sent by us to the dead comes forth within them, but a whole world. They can gaze at our world as if through a window. Conversely, the dead can experience their present spiritual environment only to the degree in which they formerly reflected, as much as earthly men are capable of doing, on the spiritual world. You know how many people are saying nowadays, "Why should I worry about life after death? We might as well wait. Once we are dead, we shall see what is going to happen." This thought, however, is completely misleading. People who have not reflected while still alive on the spiritual world, who have lived in a purely materialistic way, will see absolutely nothing after death. Here I have outlined to you how the dead are living during the period in which, commensurate with their experiences in the sleeping state, they pass through their life in reverse. The human being who has now discarded his physical and etheric body feels himself to be at this time in the realm of spiritual moon forces. We must realize all that the world organisms, moon, sun, and stars, inasmuch as they are visible to physical eyes, actually represent only physical formations of a spiritual element. Just as the single man who is sitting here on a chair consists not only of flesh and blood, which can be regarded as matter, but also of soul and spirit, so the whole universe, the whole cosmos, is indwelled by soul and spirit. And not only one unified spiritual entity dwells therein, but many, innumerably many, spiritual entities dwell therein. Thus numerous spiritual entities are connected with the moon, which is seen only externally as a silver disk by our physical eye. We are in the realm of these entities while retracing our earth life, as has been described, until we arrive again at the starting point. Thus it might be said, until then we dwell in the realm of the moon. While we are in the midst of this going backward, our whole life becomes intermingled with certain things, which are brought to an approximate conclusion after we have left the moon realm. Immediately after the etheric body has been discarded by us in the wake of death, a moral judgment on our worth as human beings emerges from the nightly experiences. Then we cannot do otherwise than judge in a moral sense the events through which we pass in reverse. And it is very strange how things develop from this point. Here on earth we carry a body made of bones, muscles, arteries, and so forth. Then after death we acquire a spiritual a spiritual body formed out of our moral qualities. Let me read that sentence again. Then, after death, we acquire a spiritual body formed out of our moral qualities. A good man acquires a moral body radiating with beauty. A depraved man a moral body radiating with evil. This is formed while we are living backward. Our spirit body, however, is only partly formed out of that which is now joined to us. Whereas one part of the spirit body received by us in the spiritual world is formed out of our moral qualities, the other part is simply put on us as a garment woven from the substances of the spiritual world. Now, after finishing our reverse course, and arriving again at the starting point, we must find the transition to which I alluded in my Theosophy as the transition from the soul world into the spirit realm. This is connected with the necessity of leaving the moon sphere and entering the sun sphere of the cosmos. We become gradually acquainted with the all-encompassing entities dwelling in the form of spirit and soul within the sun sphere. This we must enter. In the next few days I shall discuss to what degree the Christ plays a leading role in helping the human being to make this transition from the moon sphere to the sun sphere. This role is different after the mystery of Golgotha from the role he played before the mystery of Golgotha. Today we shall describe the passage through this world in a more objective way. What ensues at this point is the necessity of depositing in the moon sphere all that was woven for us, as it were, out of our moral qualities. This represents something like a small package, which we must deposit in the moon sphere in order that we may enter as purely spiritual beings into the pure sun sphere. Then we see the sun in its real aspect, not from the side turned toward earth, but from the reverse side, where it is completely filled with spiritual entities, where we can fully see that it is a spiritual realm. It is here that we give as nourishment to the universe everything that does not belong to our moral qualities, but which has been granted to us by the gods in the form of earthly experiences. We give to the universe whatever it can use for maintaining the world's course. These things are actually true. If I compared the universe to a machine, you know that I do this merely in a pictorial sense, for I am certainly not inclined to designate the universe a machine, then everything brought by us into the sun sphere, after depositing our small package in the moon sphere, would be something like fuel, apportioned by us to the cosmos as fuel is apportioned to a machine. Thus we enter the realm of the spiritual world. For it does not matter whether we call our new abode the sun sphere, in its spiritual aspect, or the spiritual world. Here we dwell as a spirit among spirits, just as we dwelled on earth as a physical man among the entities of the various natural kingdoms. Now we dwell among those entities which I described and named in my occult science, and we also dwell among those souls which have died before us, or are still awaiting their coming earth life, for we are dwelling as a spirit among spirits. These spiritual entities may belong to the higher hierarchies, or be incorporeal men dwelling in the spiritual world. And now the question arises, what is our next stage? Here on earth we stand at a certain point of the physical universe. Looking around in every direction, we see what lies outside the human being. That which lies inside him, we are utterly unable to see. Now you will say, what you tell us is foolish. It may be granted that ordinary people cannot see man's inside, but the learned anatomists who cut up dead people in hospitals are certainly familiar with it. They are not familiar with it in the least. For what can be learned about a man in this way is only something external. After all, if we regard a human being merely from the outside, it does not matter whether we investigate his outer skin or his insides. What lies inside the human being is not that which anatomists discover in an external way, but what lies inside the human skin are whole worlds. In a human lung, for instance, in every human organ, whole universes are compressed to miniature forms. We see marvelous sights when admiring a beautiful landscape, marvelous sights when admiring at night the starry sky in all its splendor. Yet, if viewing a human lung, a human liver, not with the anatomist's physical eye, but with the eye of the spirit, we see whole worlds compressed into a small space. Apart from the splendor and glory of all the rivers and mountains on the surface of the earth, a still more exalted splendor adorns what lies inside of man's skin, even in its merely physical aspect. It is irrelevant that all this is of smaller scale than the seemingly vast world of space. If you survey what lies in a single pulmonary vesicle, it will appear as more grandiose than the whole range of the mighty Alps. For what lies inside of man is the whole spiritual cosmos in condensed form. In man's inner organism, we have an image of the entire cosmos. We can visualize these things also in a somewhat different way. Imagine that you are 30 years old and looking into yourself with a glance of the soul, remembering something which you experienced between your 10th and 20th year. Here, the outer event has been transformed into an inner soul image. In a single moment, you may survey widely spread experiences undergone by you in the course of years. A world has been woven into an ideational image. Only think of what you experience when brief memory images of widely spread events passed through by you come forth in your soul life. Here you have the soul essence of what you experienced on earth. Now, if viewing your brain, the inside of your eye, the inside of the eye alone represents a whole world, your lung, your other organs in the same way as your memory images, then these organs are not images of events passed through by you, but images, even if appearing in material form, of the whole spiritual cosmos. Let us suppose that man could solve the riddle of what is contained in his brain, in the inside of his eye, in the inside of his lung, just as he can solve the riddle of the memories contained in his soul life. Then the whole spiritual cosmos would be opened up to him, just as a series of events undergone in life are opened up to him by a single memory image. As human beings, we incorporate the whole memory of the world. If you consider these things in the right way, you will understand the following. The human being who has undergone after death all the states described by me previously now becomes manifest to the vision of man himself. The human being is a spirit among spirits. Yet what he sees now is his world. Let me read that again. Yet what he sees now as his world is the marvel of the human organism itself in the form of the universe, the whole cosmos. Just as mountains, rivers, stars, and clouds form our surroundings here on earth, so when dwelling as spirit among spirits, we find our surroundings, our world, in man's wonderful organism. We look around in the spiritual world. We look, if I may express myself pictorially, to the right and to the left. As here we found rocks, river, mountains on all sides, so there above we find the human being, man, on all sides. Man is the world. And we are working for this world, which is fundamentally man. Just as on earth we build machines, keep books, sew clothes, make shoes, or write books, thus weaving together what is called the content of civilization, of culture, so above, together with the spirits of the higher hierarchies and incorporeal human beings, we weave the woof and weft of mankind. We weave mankind out of the cosmos. Here on earth we appear as finished products. There we lay down the spiritual germ of earthly man. This is the great mystery, that man's heavenly occupation consists in weaving, in cooperation with the spirits of the higher hierarchies, the great spiritual germ of the future terrestrial human being. Inside the spiritual cosmos, all of us are weaving in magnificent spiritual grandeur the woof and weft of our own earthly existence, which will be attained by us after descending again into earthly life. Our work, performed in cooperation with the gods, is the fashioning of the earthly human being. When we speak of germs here on earth, we think of something small which becomes big. If we speak, however, of the germ of the physical human being as it exists in the spiritual world, for the physical germ maturing in the mother's body is only an image of the spiritual germ, we must think of it as immense, enormous. It is a universe, and all other human beings are interlinked with this universe. It might be said all human beings are in the same place, yet numerically differentiated. And then the spiritual germ diminishes more and more. What we undergo in the time between death and a new birth is the experience of fashioning a spiritual germ as large as the universe of our coming earthly existence. Then the spiritual germ begins to shrink. More and more its essence becomes convoluted. Finally, it produces its own image in the mother's body. Materialistic physiology has entirely wrong conceptions of these things. It assumes that man, whose marvelous form I have tried to sketch for you, came forth from a merely physical human germ. This science considers the ovum to be a highly complicated matter, and physiological chemists investigate the fact that molecules or atoms, becoming more and more complicated, produce the germ, the most complicated phenomenon of all. All this, however, is not true. In reality, the ovum consists of chaotic matter. Matter, when transformed into a germ, is dissolved. It becomes completely pulverized. The nature of the physical germ, and the human germ particularly, is characterized by being composed of completely pulverized matter, which wants nothing for itself. Because this matter is completely pulverized and wants nothing for itself, it enables the spiritual germ, which has been prepared for a long time, to enter into it. And this pulverization of the physical germ is brought about by conception. Physical matter is completely destroyed in order that the spiritual germ may be sunk into it and make the physical matter into an image of the spiritual germ woven out of the cosmos. It is doubtless justified to sing the praises of all that human beings are doing for civilization, for culture on earth. Far from condemning this singing of praises, I declare myself once and for all in favor of it when it is done in a reasonable way. But a much more encompassing, a much more exalted, a much more magnificent work than all earthly cultural activity is performed by heavenly civilization, as it might be called, between death and a new birth. the spiritual preparation, the spiritual weaving of the human body. For nothing more exalted exists in the world order than the weaving of a human being out of the world's ingredients. With the help of the gods, the human being is woven during the important period between death and a new birth. If yesterday I had to say that in a certain sense all the experience and knowledge acquired by us on earth provide nourishment for the cosmos, it must be said again today. After offering to the cosmos as nourishment or fuel all the earthly experiences that could be of use to it, we receive from the fullness of the cosmos all the substances out of which we are able to weave again the new human being into whom we shall enter at a later time. The human being, now devoting himself wholly to a spiritual world, lives as a spirit. His entire weaving and being is spiritual work, spiritual essence. This stage lasts for a long time, for it must be repeated again and again. To weave something like the human being is a mighty and grandiose task. Not without justification did the ancient mysteries call the human physical body a temple. The greater the insight we gain into the science of initiation, into what takes place between death and a new birth, the deeper do we feel the significance of this word. Our life between death and a new birth is of such a nature that we as spiritual beings become directly aware of other spiritual beings. This condition lasts for some time. Then a new stage sets in. What took place previously was of such a nature that the single spiritual beings could really be viewed as individualities. The spiritual beings with whom one worked were met face to face, as it were. At a later stage, however, these spiritual entities, to express it pictorially, because such things can be suggested only in images, become less and less distinct, finally being merged into an aggregation of spirits. This can be expressed in the following way. A certain period between death and a new birth is spent in immediate proximity to spiritual beings. Then comes a time when one experiences only the revelation of these spiritual beings, when they become manifest to us as a whole. I want to use a very trivial metaphor. On seeing what seems to be a tiny gray cloud in the distance, you would be sure that this was just a tiny gray cloud, but by coming closer you would recognize it to be a swarm of flies. Now you can see each single fly. In the case of the spiritual beings, the opposite took place. First you behold the divine spiritual beings with whom you are working as single individualities. Then, after living with them more intensively, you behold their general spiritual atmosphere, just as you beheld the swarm of flies in the shape of a cloud. Here, where the single individualities disappear more and more, you live, I might say, in pantheistic fashion in the midst of a general spiritual world. Although we live now in a general spiritual world, we feel arising out of our inner depth a stronger sense of self-consciousness than we experienced before. Formerly yourself was constituted in such a way that you seemed to be at one with the spiritual world, which you experienced by means of its individualities. Now you perceive the spiritual world only as a general spiritual atmosphere. Your own self-consciousness, however, is perceived in greater degree. It awakens with heightened intensity. And thus, slowly and gradually, the desire of returning to earth again arises in the human being. This desire must be described in the following way. During the entire period which I have described, and which lasts for centuries, the human being, except in the first stage when he was still connected with the earth and returned to his starting point, is fundamentally interested in nothing but the spiritual world. He weaves in the large scale that I have described the fabric of mankind. At the moment when the individualities of the spiritual world are merged together, as it were, and man perceives the spiritual world in a general way, there arises in him a renewed interest in earth life. This interest for earth life appears in a certain specialized manner, in a certain concrete manner. The human beings begin to be interested in definite persons living below on earth, and again in their children, and again in their children's children. Whereas the human beings were formerly interested only in heavenly events, they now become, after beholding the spiritual world as a revelation, strangely interested in certain successive generations. These are the generations leading to our own parents, who will bear us on our return to earth. Yet we are interested a long time before in our parents' ancestors. We follow the line of generations until reaching our parents. Not only do we follow each generation as it passes through time, but once the spiritual world has been manifested to us as a revelation, we also foresee, as if prophetically, the whole span of generations. Across the succession of great-great-great-grandfathers, great-great-grandfathers, great-grandfathers, grandfathers, and so forth, we can foresee the path on which we shall descend again to earth. Having first grown into the cosmos, we grow later into real, concrete human history. And thus comes the moment when we gradually, in regard to our consciousness, leave the sun sphere. Of course, we still remain within the sun sphere, but the distinct, clear, conscious relation to it becomes dim, and we are drawn back into the moon sphere. And here in the moon sphere we find the small package deposited by us. I can describe it only by means of this image. We find again what represents the worth of our moral qualities, and this package must be retrieved. It will be seen in the course of the next days what a significant part is played in this connection by the Christ impulse. We must embody within us this package of destiny. But while embodying within us the package of destiny and entering the moon sphere, while gaining a stronger and stronger feeling of self-consciousness and transforming ourselves inwardly more and more into soul beings, we gradually lose the tissue woven by us out of our physical body. The spiritual germ woven by ourselves is lost at the moment when the physical germ, which we shall have to assume on earth, is engendered through the act of conception. The spiritual germ of the physical body has already descended to earth, whereas we still dwell in the spiritual world. And now a vehement feeling of bereavement sets in. We have lost the spiritual germ of the physical body. This has already arrived below and united itself with the last of those successive generations which we have watched. We ourselves, however, are still above. The feeling of bereavement becomes violent. And now this feeling of bereavement draws out of the universe the needful ingredients of the world ether. Having sent the spiritual germ of the physical body down to earth and remained behind as a soul, ego and astral body, we draw etheric substance out of the world ether and form our own etheric body. And to this etheric body, formed by ourselves, is joined approximately 3 weeks after the fecundation has taken place on earth, the physical germ which formed itself out of the spiritual germ, as I have described previously. It was said that we form our etheric body before uniting ourselves with our own physical germ, and into this etheric body is woven the small package containing our moral worth. We weave this package into our ego, our astral body, and also into our etheric body. Thus it is joined to the physical body. In this way we bring our karma down to earth. First it was left behind in the moon sphere, for had we taken it with us into the sun sphere, we would have formed a diseased, a disfigured physical body. The human physical body acquires individuality only through the circumstance of its being permeated by the etheric body. Otherwise all physical bodies would be exactly alike. For human beings, while dwelling in the spiritual world, weave identical spiritual germs for their physical body. We become individualities only by means of our karma, by means of the small package interwoven by us with our etheric body, which shapes, constitutes, and pervades our physical body already during the embryonic stage. Of course, I shall have to enlarge during the next days on this sketch concerning the human being's transition between death and a new birth. Yet you will have realized what a wealth of experiences is undergone by us. The great experience of how we are first merged into the cosmos, and then out of the cosmos again are shaped in order to attain a new human earth life. Fundamentally, we pass through 3 stages. First, we dwell as spirit soul among spirit souls. This is a genuine experiencing of the spiritual world. Secondly, we are given a revelation of the spiritual world. The individualities of the single spiritual entities become blurred, as it were. The spiritual world is revealed to us as a whole. Now we approach again the moon sphere. Within ourselves, the feeling of self-consciousness awakens. This is a preparation for earthly self-consciousness. Whereas we did not desire earth life while being conscious of our spiritual self within the spiritual world, we now begin, during the period of revelation, to desire earth life and develop a vigorous self-consciousness directed toward the earth. In the third stage, we enter the moon sphere, and having yielded our spiritual germ to the physical world, draw together out of all the heaven worlds the etheric substance needed for our own etheric body. 3 successive stages: a genuine life within the spiritual world, a life amidst the revelations of the spiritual world in which we feel ourselves already as an egoistic self, a life devoted to the drawing together of the world ether. The counterparts of these stages are produced after the human being has moved again into his physical body. These counterparts are of a most surprising nature. We see the child. We see it before us in its physical body. The child develops. This development of the child is the most wonderful thing to behold in the physical world. We see how it first crawls and then assumes a state of balance with regard to the world. We observe how the child learns to walk. Immeasurably great things are connected with this learning to walk. It represents an entrance of the child's whole being into the state of equilibrium of the world. It represents a genuine orientation of the whole cosmos toward the world's 3 spatial dimensions. And the child's wonderful achievement consists in the fact that it finds the correct human state of equilibrium within the world. These things are a modest terrestrial counterpart of all that the human being, while dwelling as a spirit among spirits, underwent in the course of long centuries. We feel great reverence for the world if we look at it in such wise that we observe a child, how it first kicks its limbs awkwardly in every direction, then gradually learns to control itself. This is the after effect of the movements which we executed during centuries as a spiritual being among spiritual beings. It is really wonderful to discover in the child's single movements, in its search for a state of equilibrium, the terrestrial after effects of those heavenly movements executed in a purely spiritual sense as spirit among spirits. Every child, unless some abnormal condition changes the sequence, should first learn to walk, attain a state of equilibrium, and then learn to speak. Now, again, the child, by an imitative process, adjusts itself through the use of language to its environment. But in every sound, every word formation shaping itself in the child, we find a modest terrestrial echo of the experience undergone by us when our knowledge of the spiritual world becomes revelation. When this knowledge is compressed, as it were, into a uniform haze, then the world logos is formed out of the world's single being, which we experienced previously in an individualized way. And when the child utters one word after the other, this is the audible terrestrial counterpart of a marvelous world tableau experienced by us during the time of revelation, before we return again to the moon sphere. And when the child, having learned to walk and speak, gradually develops its thoughts, for learning to think should be the third step in a normal human development, this is a counterpart of the work performed by man while forming his own etheric body out of the world ether, gathered from every part of the universe. Thus, in looking at the child as it enters the world, we see in the 3 modest faculties needed to gain a dynamic, static relationship to the world, learning to maintain equilibrium, what we call learning to walk, learning to speak, learning to think, the compressed, modest, terrestrial counterparts of that which, spread out into grandiose cosmic dimensions, represents the stages passed through by us between death and a new birth. Only by gaining a knowledge of the spiritual life between death and a new birth do we gain a knowledge of the mystery coming forth from man's innermost depth, when the child, having been born in a uniform state, becomes increasingly differentiated. Hence, by pointing to every single being as a revelation of the divine, we learn to understand the world as a revelation of the divine. The end of Lecture 2 of Man's Being, His Destiny, and World Evolution. Lecture 3 of Man's Being, His Destiny, and World Evolution. Yesterday we had to speak of the path pursued by man between death and a new birth. And the whole gist of my remarks will have shown you that every night during sleep we must return to the starting point of our earth life. We can indeed gain insight into these significant matters if we realize that on sinking into slumber we do not stand still at the date reached in the course of our earthly life, as was already explained in the previous lectures, but that we actually go back to our starting point. Every time during sleep we are carried back to our childhood, and even to the state before our childhood, before our arrival on earth. Hence, while we are asleep, our ego and our astral body return to the spiritual world, to the world of our origin, which we left in order to become earthmen. At this point of our discourse it becomes necessary to let pass before our soul, in greater detail, what the human being undergoes while asleep, undergoes unconsciously, but nonetheless most vividly. The duration of our sleep does not really matter, although it is difficult for our ordinary consciousness to conceive of the fact that time and space conditions are utterly different in the spiritual world. We must learn to form conceptions of such a kind. I have already said that the human being, when suddenly awakened after he has fallen asleep and hence lost consciousness, experiences during that brief moment whatever he would have experienced had his sleep continued for a long time. In measuring the length of our sleep, according to its physical duration, we take into account only our physical and our etheric body. Utterly different time conditions prevail for that which is undergone by our ego and astral body. Hence the things that I shall presently explain to you are valid for either a long or a short sleep. When the human personality enters the realm of sleep with his soul, the first state experienced by him, all this takes place in the unconscious, yet with great vividness, engenders a feeling in him of dwelling, as it were, in a general world ether. In speaking of feeling, I mean an unconscious feeling. It is impossible to express these matters otherwise than by terms used in ordinary conscious life. The person feels himself as it were disseminated into the whole cosmos. We cease to have the definite perceptions which formerly connected us with all the things surrounding us in our earthly existence. At first we take part in the general weaving and surging of the cosmos, and this is accompanied by the feeling that our souls have their being in a bottomless element. Hence the soul, while existing in this bottomless element, has an ardent desire for divine support. Thus we experience every evening when falling asleep the religious need of having the whole world permeated by an all-encompassing divine spiritual element. This is our real experience when falling asleep. Our whole constitution as human beings enables us to transfer this desire for the divine into our waking life. Day in and day out we are indebted to our nightly experiences for renewing our religious needs. Thus only a contemplation of our entire being enables us to gain insight into the various life experiences undergone by us. Fundamentally, we live very thoughtlessly if we take into account only the conscious life passed between morning and evening, for many night experiences are interwoven with this. The human being does not always realize whence he derives his living religious need. He derives it from the general experiences undergone by him every night just after having fallen asleep, and also, although perhaps less intensively, during an afternoon nap. Then in our sleep another stage sets in, all this, as was said before, being passed through unconsciously, but nonetheless vividly. Now it does not seem to the sleeper that his soul is, as it were, disseminated into the general cosmos, but it seems as if the single parts of his entity were divided. Were our experiences to become conscious, we would feel as though we were being disjointed. And from the bottom of our soul an unconscious fear rises up. Every night while asleep we experience the fear of being divided up into the whole universe. Now you might say, what does all this matter as long as we know nothing about it? Well, it matters a great deal. I should like to explain by means of a comparison how much it matters. Suppose that we become frightened in ordinary daily life. We turn pale. The emotion of fear is consciously felt by the soul. A definite change in our organism makes us turn pale. The blood streams back into the body's interior. This is an objective process. We can describe the emotion of fear in connection with an objective process taking place in daily conscious life within the physical body. What we experience in our soul is, as it were, a mirrored image, reflecting this streaming away of the blood from the body's surface to its inner parts. Thus an objective process corresponds, in the waking state, to the emotion of fear. When we are asleep, a similar objective process, wholly independent of our consciousness, occurs in our astral body. Anyone able to form imaginative and inspired conceptions will experience this objective process in the astral body as an emotion of fear. The objective element in fear, however, is actually experienced by man every night, because he feels himself being divided into parts inside his soul. And how is he being divided? Every night he is divided among the universe of stars. One part of his soul substance is striving toward Mercury, another part toward Jupiter, and so on, and so forth. Yet this process can only be correctly characterized by saying, during ordinary sleep, we do not actually penetrate the worlds of stars, as is the case on the path between death and a new birth. What we really undergo every night is not an actual division among the stars, but only among the counterparts of the stars, which we carry within us during our entire earth life. While asleep, we are divided among the counterparts of Mercury, Venus, Moon, Sun, and so forth. Thus we are concerned here not with the original stars themselves, but with their counterparts in us. This emotion of fear, experienced by us relatively soon after falling asleep, can be removed only from that human being who feels a genuine kinship to the Christ. At this moment we become aware how much the human being needs this kinship with the Christ. In speaking of this kinship, it is necessary to envisage man's evolution on earth. Mankind's evolution on earth can be comprehended only by someone having real insight into the significant turning point brought to human evolution by the mystery of Golgotha. It is a fact that the human beings before the mystery of Golgotha were different with regard to soul and spirit from the human beings after the mystery of Golgotha had occurred on earth. This must be taken into account if man's soul is to be viewed in its right light, in its true light. When the human beings who lived before the mystery of Golgotha, and these human beings were actually we ourselves in a former life, fell asleep and experienced the fear of which I have just spoken, then the counterpart of the Christ in the world of stars existed for the human beings of that time as much as did the counterparts of the other heavenly bodies. And as the Christ approached the sleeping human being, he came as a helper to dissipate fear, to destroy fear. People of earlier ages, still gifted with instinctive clairvoyance, remembered after awaking in a dreamlike consciousness that the Christ had been with them in their sleep. Only they did not call him the Christ, they called him the Sun Spirit. Yet these people who lived before the mystery of Golgotha avowed from their innermost depth that the great Sun Spirit was also the great guide and helper of the human being, who approached him every night in sleep and relieved him of the fear of being disseminated into the universe. The Christ appeared as a spirit, strengthening mankind and consolidating its inner life. Who binds together man's forces during his life? Asked the followers of ancient religions. It is the great Sun Spirit who firmly binds together man's single elements and combines them into one personality. And this avowal was uttered by the followers of ancient religions because their consciousness was pervaded by the memory that the Christ approached man every night. We do not need to be amazed at these things. In those ancient times, when the human being was still capable of instinctive clairvoyance, he could look back at significant moments of his life into the period passed through by him before his soul and spirit descended to earth and was clothed in a physical body. Thus it seemed quite natural to the human being that he could look upward into a pre-earthly existence. But is it not a fact that, as we explained before, every period of sleep carries us back into pre-earthly existence, into an existence preceding the stage before we became a truly conscious child? This question must be answered in the affirmative. And just as human beings knew that they had been together in their pre-earthly existence with the exalted Son Spirit who had given them the strength to pass through death as immortal beings, so they also consciously remembered after every sleep that the exalted Son Spirit had stood at their side, helping them to become real human beings, integrated personalities. The human soul, while acquainting itself with the world of planets, passes through this stage during sleep. It is as if the soul were first dispersed among the counterparts of the planets and then united and held together by the Christ. Consider that this whole soul experience during sleep has changed with regard to the human being since the mystery of Golgotha. For the mystery of Golgotha has originated the unfolding of a vigorous human ego consciousness. This ego consciousness, pervading human culture, only gradually after the mystery of Golgotha, became especially apparent after the first third of the 15th century. And the same vigorous ego consciousness, which enables the human being to place himself as a free, fully self-conscious being into the sense world, this same consciousness, as though trying to maintain equilibrium, also darkens his retrospect into pre-earthly existence, darkens his conscious memory of the helping Christ who stood at his side during sleep. It is remarkable that since the mystery of Golgotha, human evolution has taken the following course. On the one hand, man acquired a vigorous ego consciousness in his waking state. On the other hand, utter darkness gradually overlaid that which had formerly radiated out of sleep consciousness. Therefore, human beings are obliged, since the mystery of Golgotha, to establish a conscious relationship to Christ Jesus while they are awake. They must acquire in a conscious way a comprehension of what the mystery of Golgotha really signifies. That, by means of the mystery of Golgotha, the exalted Son Spirit, Christ, descended to earth, became a human being in the body of Jesus of Nazareth, passed through earth life and death, and after death still taught his disciples, who were permitted to behold him in his etheric body after death. Those personalities who acquire in the time following the mystery of Golgotha a waking consciousness of their kinship with the Christ, and gain a living conception of what took place through the mystery of Golgotha, to these the possibility will be given of being helped by the Christ impulse as it is carried from their waking state into their sleep. This shows us how differently human sleep was constituted before and after the mystery of Golgotha. Before the mystery of Golgotha, the Christ invariably appeared as helper while the human being slept. Man could remember, even after awaking, that the Christ had been with him during his sleep. After the mystery of Golgotha, however, he would be utterly bereft of the Christ's help if he were not to establish a conscious relation with the Christ during the day, while awake, and carry its echo, its after-effect into his sleep. Only in this way can the Christ help him to maintain his personality while asleep. What the human being had received unconsciously from the wide heavenly reaches before the mystery of Golgotha, the help of the Christ, the human soul must now acquire gradually by establishing a conscious relation with the mystery of Golgotha. This inner soul responsibility has been laid upon the human being since the mystery of Golgotha. Thus we are unable to study the nature of human sleep unless we are able to envisage the immense transformation undergone by human sleep since the mystery of Golgotha. When we enter the realm of sleep, our whole world becomes different from that experienced in the waking state. How do we live as physical men while awake? We are confined through our physical body by natural laws. The laws working outside in nature are also working within us. That which we recognize as moral responsibilities and impulses, as moral world order, stands like an abstract world amidst the laws of nature. And because present-day natural science takes into account only the waking world, it is completely ignorant of the moral world. Thus natural science tells us, although hypothetically yet in conformity with its principles, that the Kant-Laplace primeval fog marked the starting point of world evolution, and that this world evolution will be terminated through a state of heat which will kill all living things and bury them, as it were, in a huge cosmic cemetery. These conceptions have been modified but still prevail among natural scientists. Natural science, in describing the evolution of the cosmos, begins and ends with a physical state. Here the moral world order appears as a stranger. The human being, however, would not be aware of his dignity, would not even experience himself as a human being, unless he experienced himself as a moral being. But what moral impulses could be found in the Kant-Laplace primeval fog? Here were nothing but physical laws. Will there be moral impulses when the earth shall perish from heat? Then also nothing but physical laws will prevail. Thus speaks natural science. And out of the natural process germinate all living things, and out of living things the human soul element. The human being forms certain conceptions. One should act in a certain way, or one should not act in that way. He experiences a moral world order. But this cannot be nurtured by natural law. To the waking human being, the moral world order appears like a merely abstract world amidst the rigid, massive world of natural laws. It is entirely different when imaginative, inspirative, and intuitive consciousness passes through that which the human being, between falling asleep and awaking, experiences in his ego and astral body. Here the moral world order appears real, whereas the natural order below appears like something abstract, something dreamlike. Although it is difficult to conceive of these things, they are nonetheless true. The whole world has been turned upside down. To the sleeper, acquiring clairvoyance in his sleep, the moral world order would seem something real, something secure, and the physical world order of natural laws would seem to sink below, not rise above the moral world order. And if the sleeper possessed consciousness, he would not place the Kant-Laplace theory at the starting point of world evolution and the death through heat at its end. At the starting point, he would recognize the world of spiritual hierarchies, all the spirit and soul beings who lead man into existence. At the end of world evolution, he would again recognize the spirit and soul beings who extend to man who has passed through the course of evolution a welcome to enter their community. And below, as an illusion, the abstract physical world order would have its welling and streaming existence. If you were gifted with clairvoyance, in the very midst between falling asleep and awaking, you would view all the natural laws of which you have learned during the day as a mirage of dreams, dreamed by the earth. And it would be the moral world order which would give you a firm ground. And this moral world order could be experienced by us if we worked our way, after having received the help of the Christ, into the peace of the fixed stars in the firmament, seen by us again during nightly sleep in the form of their counterparts. Soaring upward to the fixed stars, to their counterparts, we look down into the physical realm of natural law. This is the wholly divergent form of the experiences undergone by the human being between falling asleep and awaking, and leading his soul every night into the image of the cosmos. And just as the human being is led at a certain moment between death and a new birth, as I explained yesterday, by the moon forces into earthly existence, and is beset by a sort of longing for earthly existence, so is he beset by the longing, after experiencing heavenly existence in his sleep, to immerse himself again into his physical body and etheric body. While we get accustomed to earth life after our birth, we live in a sort of sleep and dream state. If we, disregarding our dreams, look back in the morning after being awake for an hour to the moment of awaking, our consciousness is halted abruptly, and we see behind us the darkness of slumber. It is similar when we look back into our childhood. In our 4th or the 5th year, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, our consciousness comes to a stop. Beyond the last stage that we can still remember lies something which is as deeply immersed in the darkness of the sleep and dreamlike life of early childhood as is the life of the human soul, immersed every night in the darkness of sleep. Yet the child is not wholly asleep, but is wrapped in a sort of waking dream. During this waking dream occur the 3 important phases of human life which I indicated yesterday. As they occur in the sequence characterized by me, we can see in them echoes and after-effects of the life between death and a new birth. First, the child learns out of a life wrapped in dream and sleep what we call simply learning how to walk. Something all-encompassing happens when a child learns how to walk, something which appears as a grandiose and overwhelming process to anyone able to perceive how the subtlest parts of the human body are changed at this time. The child, by adapting himself to the relationships of gravity, learns how to attain equilibrium. The child no longer falls down. By unfolding inner forces, he conforms to spatial directions. What if we had to do all this consciously? Overcome the lack of equilibrium that pulled us to the ground, adapt our organism to a firm state of equilibrium with regard to the 3 spatial directions, and even maintain this state of equilibrium by swinging our legs like pendulums as we learn how to walk? The child, in performing such a grandiose mechanical task, performs it as an echo of what he experienced while dwelling among spirits between death and a new birth. Here we encounter something so comprehensive, so marvelous, that the most eminent engineer with all his earthly scientific equipment could not calculate how the child's human forces adapt themselves to the world's spatial connections. What we, as a child, attain unconsciously is the most miraculous unfolding of mathematical, mechanical, physical forces. We call it simply learning how to walk. Yet in this learning how to walk lies an element of utmost grandeur. Simultaneously, the correct use of arms and hands is attained, and by placing himself as physical being within the 3 spatial directions, the human being receives the foundation for all that is called learning how to walk, learning how to talk. The only thing known to physiology about the connection between man's dynamics of walking and standing and the faculty of speech is the fact that the speech center of right-handed persons lies in the left portion of the brain. The gestures of the right hand, vigorously executed by means of man's willpower, are led by some mysterious process into the interior of the brain, whence the faculty of speech is brought to the human being. More, however, exists than this connection between the right hand and the 3rd convolution at the left, the so-called Broca cerebral convolution. The whole mobility of arms and fingers, the whole human being's whole ability to move and maintain equilibrium reaches up into the brain, becomes part of the brain, and thence reaches down into the larynx. Language develops out of walking, out of the grasping of objects, out of gestures flowing from the organs of movement. Anyone viewing these things correctly will note that a child with the tendency to walk on his toes speaks differently from a child walking on his heels, employs different shadings of sound. The organism of speaking develops from the organism of walking and moving, and speech is again a counterpart of that which I described yesterday as the outpouring of revelation upon the human being passing through the stage between death and a new birth. The child, when learning how to speak, does not grasp the words with his thoughts, but alone with his emotions. He lives in the language as if it were an emotional element, and a child of normal development learns conceptual thinking only after acquiring the faculty of speech. A child's thoughts actually develop out of the words. Just as walking and the grasping of objects, the gestures of legs and hands reach up into the speech organism, so all that lives in the speech organism and is gained through adaptation to the language of the surrounding world reaches up into the thought organs. In the 3rd stage, the child learns how to think. While encompassed by this dream and sleep state, the child passes through 3 stages: walking, speaking, and thinking. These are the 3 terrestrial counterparts of that which we experienced between death and a new birth: living contact with the spiritual world, then revelation of the spiritual world, then the gathering of the world ether in order to form our etheric body. The child's development during these 3 stages can be correctly estimated only by someone observing the adult human being during his sleep. Here we can observe how we, when sleep puts a stop to our thoughts, for our thoughts are silenced by sleep, let our thought forces be nurtured between falling asleep and awaking by those beings known to us as angels, as angeloi. These beings approaching us during sleep nurture our thought forces, while we cannot do so ourselves. During sleep, the human being also ceases to talk. Only in abnormal cases, which could be explained, does he talk in his sleep. At present, however, we may disregard these things. The normal human being ceases to talk after going to sleep. Would it not be altogether too dreadful did people keep on chattering while asleep? Hence speech ceases at that time. And what makes us speak is nurtured during the time between falling asleep and awaking by beings belonging to the hierarchy of the archangeloi. If we disregard the sleepwalker, who is also in an abnormal condition, human beings are quiet while asleep. They do not walk, they grasp no objects, they do not move. That which pertains to man's waking life, as forces which call forth the movements out of his will, is nurtured between going to sleep and awaking by beings belonging to the hierarchy of the archai. By comprehending the manner in which the hierarchical beings above the human kingdom, angels, archangels, archai, approach the ego and astral body, approach the entire human being during sleep, we can also understand how the little child masters the 3 activities of walking, speaking, and thinking. We recognize how it is the work of the archai that brings to the little child, as he masters the dynamics of life, as he masters the faculty of walking and handling objects, what the human being has experienced between death and a new birth, by coming into contact with spirit and soul beings. Now the counterpart of these experiences comes forth with the learning to walk of the little child. It is the archai, the primeval powers, who transmit to the child that learns how to walk the counterpart of all the spiritual movements emanating between death and a new birth from spirit and soul beings. And it is the archangels that transmit what the human being experiences between death and a new birth by means of revelation. They are at work when the child masters speech. And the angels carry down the forces developed by the human being when out of the whole world ether he gathered the substance for his etheric body. The angels, bringing down these forces, mold their counterparts within the thought organs, which are plastically formed in order that the child may learn thinking by means of language. You must keep in mind that anthroposophy does more than look at the physical world and say, it is based on something spiritual. That would be much too easy. By such a way of thinking, we would acquire no real conception of the spiritual world. Someone who is determined to repeat in philosophic terms that the physical world rests on a spiritual foundation would be like a man who, when walking across a meadow, is told by his companion, "Look, this flower is a dandelion, these are daisies," and so forth. The first man, however, might reply, "Indeed, I am not interested in these names. Here I see flowers, just flowers in the abstract." Such a person would be like a philosopher who recognizes only the pantheistic spiritual element, but refuses to discuss the concrete facts, the particular formations of the spiritual. What we are given by anthroposophy shows us how the divine spiritual dwells everywhere in life's single formations. We look at the way in which the child passes from the clumsy stage of crawling to that of walking. Looking in admiration and reverence at this grandiose world phenomenon, we see in it the work of the archai, who are active when the experiences we undergo between death and a new birth are transformed into their earthly shape. We follow the process through which the child produces speech out of his inner self. We follow the activity of the archangels. And when the child begins to think, the activity of the angels. And all this has a deeply significant practical side. In our materialistic age, many people have ceased to regard words as something genuinely spiritual. More and more people use words only for the purpose of naming physical objects in the outer world. Think how many people in the world are unable to form the slightest conception of spiritual things. This is because the words have no spiritual significance for them and are used merely in connection with physical objects. For many people, speech itself has assumed a materialistic character. It can be used only in connection with physical things. Undeniably, we live within a civilization making language more and more into an instrument of materialism. And what will be the consequence? The consequence will become apparent to us if we look with regard to language at the connection between the waking and the sleeping state. While we remain awake during the day, we talk with others. We make the air vibrate. The way in which the air vibrates transmits the soul content which we wish to convey. The soul impulses of our words, however, live in our inner being. Every word corresponds to a soul impulse, which is the more powerful, the more our words are imbued with idealism, the more we are conscious of the spiritual significance contained in our words. Anyone aware of these facts will clearly recognize what lies behind them. Think of a person who uses words in a merely materialistic sense. During the day he will not differ greatly from others whose words contain an idealistic spiritual element, who know that words must be given wings by the Spirit. At night, however, the human being takes the soul and spirit element of language, together with his ego and astral body, into the spiritual world. He returns again to his spiritual origin. Those possessing only a materialistic speech cannot establish a connection with the world of the archangels. Those still possessing an idealistic speech are able to establish this connection with the world of the archangels. The tragedy inherent in a civilization whose materialism is expressed even by its language has the consequence that the human being, by letting his language become wholly materialistic, may lose the nightly connection with the world of the archangels. For the genuine spiritual scientist, there lies indeed something heartbreaking in present-day civilization. People who forget more and more to invest their words with a spiritual content lose their rightful connection with the spiritual world, with the archangels. And this terrifying fact can be perceived only by someone envisaging the true nature of the sleeping state. It is impossible to become a real anthroposophist without rising above mere theory. We may remain perfectly indifferent while developing theories on June bugs, earthworms, and cells. Such theories shall certainly break nobody's heart. For the way in which June bugs and earthworms grow out of a cell is not apt to break our heart. But if we acquire anthroposophical knowledge in all its fullness, we look into the depths of man's being, of man's evolution, of man's destiny. Thus our heart will ever be interlinked with this knowledge. The sum of this knowledge will be deposited in the life of our feelings, our emotions. Hence we partake of the whole world's feelings and also of the whole world's volition. The essence of anthroposophy consists in the fact that it grasps not only the human intellect, but the whole human being. Thereby it illuminates, with the forces of feeling and sentiment, the destinies of culture and civilization, as well as the destinies of single persons. We cannot take part genuinely in human experiences on earth unless looking also at the other side, the spiritual side, as it is unveiled to us through our knowledge of the sleeping state that leads us back into the spiritual world. Thus spiritual science can be truly at one with human life, understood in its spiritual and ultimately its social, religious, and ethical significance. This spiritual science is to become real science, which leads to wisdom. Such life-giving science is greatly needed by mankind, lest it fall deeper and deeper, lest it fall into deeper and deeper decline, instead of making a new beginning. The end of Lecture 3 of Man's Being, His Destiny, and World Evolution. Lecture 4 of Man's Being, His Destiny, and World Evolution. Lecture cycle by Rudolf Steiner. In viewing the soul of man, we find its inner element composed of thinking, or forming of mental representations, feeling, and willing. You know that these three soul activities have often been discussed by me. Nevertheless, I should like to say a few words today about this threefold constitution of the human soul, inasmuch as it is in especial connection with the present cycle. Life in the waking state is essentially concerned with our mental activity. Of what we are thinking, we are fully conscious in the waking state. If you ask yourself, are we as conscious of the feelings that we experience in the waking state as we are of the mental representations? The answer would have to be in the negative. In a certain sense, feelings are apprehended but dimly and vaguely by waking consciousness. And if you compare the experiences of your world of feelings with those confronting you in the manifold imagery of the dream world, you will find the same degree of consciousness in the world of feelings that you do in the world of dreams. In the world of feelings we dream in a different way, yet also in that world it is still only dreaming. We may be easily misled regarding the character of this world of feeling by translating that which is felt into mental representations. We make a mental image of our feelings. In this way the feelings are raised into waking consciousness. Yet the feelings as such are no more conscious than dreams. What remains still more unconscious, it might be said wholly unconscious, are man's will impulses. Try to visualize what you know of the faculty generally called willing. Suppose that you stretch out your hand in order to grasp something. First, you have a mental image of the fact that you are going to stretch out your hand. This is what you intend to do. But how this intention streams down into your whole organism, how it is imparted to the muscles, the bones, so that your hand be enabled to grasp an object, of all this you know as little as you know in your ordinary consciousness of what happens to your ego during sleep. Only after grasping the object you become aware, again by means of a mental image, of having carried out a movement. What lies between the mental image forming the intention and the image engendered within you after this intention has been acted upon externally, what happens within your organism between these two stages is hidden by a sleep which takes possession of you even in the waking state. Willing is a matter of sleeping, feeling a matter of dreaming, and only mental activity, thinking, is a matter of real waking. Here we have, even in the waking state, the threefold human soul: the waking soul that forms mental images, the dreaming soul that feels, and the willing soul that sleeps. Hence man can never know out of his ordinary consciousness what goes on in those regions where the will is weaving and living. If, however, we illuminate by the methods of anthroposophical research the regions where the will is pulsating, we discover the following. The intention of carrying out a will impulse is primarily a thought, a mental image. At the moment when this intention streams down into the organism, something is produced that might be called a process of inner combustion. Invariably, this combustion is kindled in the organism along the entire path followed by the will impulse. The combustion of metabolic products existing within you brings forth the movement used by the arm in order to carry out a will impulse. Hence, someone who wills an action undergoes in a physical sense a burning up and consuming of his metabolic products. The metabolic products must be renewed for the reason that they are being constantly burned up, consumed by the will impulse. It is different in mental activity. Here a constant depositing of salt-like particles takes place. Earthy, salt-like, ash-like particles are excreted from the organism. Thus, in a physical sense, thinking or mental activity is a depositing of salt. Willing is a combustion. To the spiritual view, human life appears as a continuous depositing of salt from above and a combustion from below. This combustion has the effect of preventing, by the fire within our body, if I may express it in this way, our perceiving. Let me read that again. This combustion has the effect of preventing, by the fire within our body, if I may express it in this way, our perceiving, by means of our ordinary consciousness, the real nature of will. This combustion puts us to sleep in regard to our will, or will impulses. And what becomes invisible to our ordinary consciousness while we are asleep? If, by the methods of spiritual research, we illuminate the organic fire constantly being kindled through the will, we perceive that this fire contains the effects of our moral behavior during previous earth lives. What lives in this fire may be designated as human destiny, human karma. It is actually true that a certain fact may assume an entirely different significance if looked at from a correct spiritual viewpoint instead of an external, sensible, intellectual one. For instance, a man may become acquainted in a certain year of his life with another man. This is generally considered as accidental, and it really seems as if the two persons had been led together by the accidents of life and become acquainted at a chance moment. Things, however, happen otherwise. If we use the methods of spiritual research and look into the whole connection of human life, if we look into everything made invisible by the previously mentioned process of combustion, we then find that an acquaintance made in a man's 35th year has been longed for and striven for by this man during his entire life according to a definite plan. If we follow someone's life from his 35th year back into his early childhood, we may uncover and reveal what paths were pursued in order to arrive at the point where the other man was encountered. All this has been carried out in accordance with a plan harbored in the unconscious. If we look at a human being's destiny in this way, it is remarkable to discover what wiles were occasionally employed by this person in order to arrive at a certain place in a certain year and to encounter a certain person. Anyone having real insight into human life cannot help but say that if someone is undergoing an experience, he himself has sought it with all the force at his command during his entire earth life. And why do we seek a particular experience? Because this seeking has been poured into our soul out of former lives. These former earth lives, however, do not show their effect inside our waking thought consciousness. They show their effect in that state of consciousness constantly lulled to sleep by the process of combustion. Although striving unconsciously, we are nonetheless striving for the attainment of our earthly experiences. Now, if something of this kind is said, various objections may arise in our thoughts. First of all, the following argument might be raised. If all this be true, then our whole life is determined by destiny. We have no freedom. But do we lose our freedom through the fact that our hair is blonde and not black? This too is predestined. We are nevertheless free, even if our hair is blonde instead of black, although we might possibly prefer black hair. We are nevertheless free, even if we cannot pull down the moon as we might have longed to do as children. We are nevertheless free, even though we have sought certain experiences since the beginning of our earth life. For not all of human life is composed of such destined experiences. These experiences are always joined to freely chosen experiences. And these freely chosen experiences joined to the others are found by spiritual science in a different place. I have often spoken of the 3 stages of spiritual knowledge. Imagination, when we first view a world of images. Inspiration, when this world of images is penetrated by spiritual reality and essence. Intuition, when we stand amid spiritual reality and essence. If the human being in the course of his spiritual research attains imagination, and hence sees before him the tableau of his life, something else always becomes visible at the same time. One cannot be attained without the other. We cannot attain imagination, real spiritual knowledge of the life lived by us heretofore on earth, without seeing emerge in a strange, memory-like manner the experiences undergone by us during sleep, between going to sleep and waking. I have told you of what these experiences consist. When attaining imagination, on the one hand, we attain, on the other, by means of the inner silence enveloping our soul, an especially profound view of what the human being experiences during sleep. I have already described to you many things experienced by us during the sleeping state. What, however, is mainly set before our inner eye in sleep concerns destiny, as it forms itself anew. If we illuminate the sleep that encompasses our will, even in the waking state, we can see at work the karma resulting from previous earth lives. And if we see in their true light the experiences undergone by us between going to sleep and awaking, we recognize how the karma that will be realized in our next earth life is being woven out of the free deeds performed by us in the present earth life. You might believe that those able to fathom the realm of sleep might be perturbed when saying to themselves, "Your own moral conduct during the present earth life is preparing your karma." Yet this fact is no more perturbing than the knowledge that the sun has risen, climbed to its highest position at noon, and sunk in the evening below the horizon, and will repeat the same course on the morrow. The lawfulness arising from the depth of slumber does not perturb us, because through freedom all that has been formed in the sleeping state of the present earth life can in the most manifold ways be brought forth during the next earth life. And when we envisage that which begins to weave itself in sleep, hidden from our ordinary consciousness as new karma, we can clearly see karma at work in the subconscious states of our will, clearly see karma being spun anew. We can also see how the past is being interwoven in the human being with the future. We can see how that which is veiled to the waking human being by sleep in the daytime, that is to say, the inner secrets of his will, is being spun together with that which is veiled to him by sleep at night, namely the inner secrets of his ego and astral body, as they have separated themselves from the physical and etheric bodies and are taking part in weaving the future karma. Consider that the things thought by man in his ordinary waking state are mostly concerned with outer matters. These outer things thought by us remain fixed by means of our soul life's ordinary content in our memory. All this, however, represents only the surface of our soul life. Beyond this thought level lies a soul life of much greater profoundness. Whatever we experience during the waking state as our thinking, we experience in the etheric body, the formative force body. All that happens at a deeper level in the astral body and the ego can be experienced only by consciously penetrating the events passed through by the astral body and the ego when they have separated themselves from the physical and etheric bodies and fallen asleep. Then the future karma is being spun. In the daytime, this future karma is veiled to us by the outward thoughts contained in the etheric body. In the depth of the soul, however, it is being woven together, also during the day, with that which dwells in unconscious sleeping will as the karma emerging from the past. Hence the karma of the human being can be accurately divulged. Here we find several interesting facts. The age of the human being's earliest childhood is especially revealing for the observation of karmic connections. The resolutions of children appear to us as utterly arbitrary, and yet they are not at all arbitrary. It is indeed true that the child's actions imitate what goes on in the child's surroundings. I have indicated in my public lecture how the child, completely at one with his sense organism, inwardly experiences every gesture, every movement made by the people around him. But he experiences every gesture, every movement in its moral significance. Hence a child who is confronted with a choleric father experiences the immoral element connected with a choleric temperament. And the child experiences through the subtlest movements of the people around him the thoughts that these people harbor. Hence we should never permit ourselves to have impure, immoral thoughts in a child's presence and say, such thoughts are permissible because the child knows nothing about them. This is not true. Whenever we think, our nerve fibers are always vibrating in one way or another, and this vibration is perceived by the child, especially during his earliest years. The child is a subtle observer and imitator of his surroundings. The strangest, and it might be said the most interesting fact, in an exalted sense, is the following. The child does not imitate everything, but takes his choice. And this choosing is done in a very complicated manner. Let us assume that the child has before him a hot-headed, choleric father who does many things that are not right. The child, wholly one with his sense organism, must absorb all these things. Since his eye cannot protect itself, it must cannot protect itself, it must perceive what takes place in the child's surroundings. What the child absorbs, however, is absorbed only in the waking state. Eventually the child goes to sleep. Children sleep a great deal, and during sleep a child is able to choose. What he wants to absorb is sent out of his soul into his body, his physical organism. What he does not want to absorb is ejected during sleep into the etheric world. Thus the child takes into his bodily organism only those things that have been predestined for him by his destiny, his karma. The working of destiny is seen with especial vividness in a child's very first years. A person with a merely intellectual bent often feels that he is tremendously clever and the child tremendously stupid. After acquiring insight into the world, we discard this opinion and begin to realize how stupid we have become since our childhood. Our present cleverness, as opposed to that of childhood, is a conscious one, yet far, far greater than all the wisdom given to us in later years is the wisdom with which the child, as was previously described, chooses between that which, according to the destiny resulting from former earth lives, he must incorporate into himself, and that which he may eject into the general etheric world. And what is brought by man from former earth lives into his present one becomes especially visible during the first years, when the question of freedom does not matter as yet. At the age when the consciousness of freedom arises, we have already brought into the present earth life most of what had been destined to be garnered from previous earth lives. And if someone has a certain experience at the age of 35, he has blazed a trail toward this experience since his first childhood years. The first steps of life are the most important and essential for all that is determined by destiny. I have tried to point out how wise we were as children, and how fundamentally we become less and less wise as life continues. Our consciousness expands. Hence we value conscious rationalism and do not value the child's unconscious wisdom. Only by acquiring the science of initiation are we taught how to value this wisdom. I have called attention to these things in the very first chapter of my booklet, Spiritual Guidance of Man and Humanity. Official philosophy has taken me severely to task on this score. It is important, nevertheless, that we are capable of looking at the first years of childhood in the right way. People, once they have understood these things, will attain a sounder judgment on something that is mentioned today again and again, but not understood in the least, the question of inherited qualities. In present-day literature and science, the tendency is to base everything on qualities that have been inherited from the parents. If we once realize how the child in a karmic sense gathers from previous earth lives whatever his wisdom urges him to select, we shall comprehend the correct relation between that which is determined by destiny and that which represents external inheritance and garb. For this inheritance is nothing but an external garb. That the latter exists will not seem strange to those comprehending in the right way how the human beings connect themselves at a certain point between death and a new birth with the sequence of generations. Turning their glance from the beyond to the earthly realm, they are able to foresee who their parents are going to be. From the beyond, we help to determine the qualities that our parents will have. Hence it is no wonder that we inherit these qualities. Yet, as was previously described, we make our choice concerning the qualities that we inherit. To observe the human being during his first childhood years is a study as interesting as it is exalted. I must use this expression again and again. You will remember that I called your attention to the three things learned by the child in his first years. Walking, which includes so many things that were discussed yesterday. speaking, and thinking. These three faculties are attained by the child. Now let us observe correctly how the child takes his first steps. He may put down his little legs and feet firmly or gently, advance courageously or timidly, bend his knee vigorously or with less vigor, use his index finger or his little finger more frequently. Those who have the right insight into what is connected with walking, what is connected with the sense of equilibrium through which the child orientates himself in the three spatial directions, all those will recognize that the child's karma is symbolically expressed in his attempts at walking. We see a certain child, as he learns how to walk, put down his little feet with firmness. This shows us that he has proved himself as brave and courageous in various situations belonging to previous earth lives. This brave and courageous quality coming from previous earth lives is expressed in a sensible image by the firm manner in which the child plants his little feet on the ground. Thus we may observe just in the child's first attempts at walking a miraculous image of human karma. A man's personal karma is especially expressed by the manner in which he learns how to walk. In the second place, we learn how to speak. We imitate what is spoken around us. Every child does this in his own way, yet all human beings who learn how to speak their mother tongue within a lingual province imitate just this one language. Hence we find that the human being's folk destiny is expressed by the way in which the child adapts himself to the imitation of sounds. The child, when learning how to walk, expresses his individual destiny. When learning how to speak, his folk destiny. And when learning how to think, he expresses the destiny of universal mankind living in a certain period all over the globe. Thus a threefold destiny is interwoven in man. It is true that we clothe our thoughts with diverse languages. Yet when penetrating across language to the thoughts, we assume that these can be understood by every person anywhere in the world. A Chinese and a Norwegian language exist. Nonetheless, there is no difference, except an individual one, between Chinese and Norwegian thoughts. For it must be admitted that thoughts as such, with regard to their truth or untruth, are the same everywhere. They are differently colored for the sole reason that human beings express themselves through language and individual traits. The thought content, however, not the form, is alike for all men. By adjusting himself to thought life in his third stage, the child adjusts himself at a certain point to all of mankind. Through language he adjusts himself to the folk destiny. Through his orientation in three spatial directions, by learning how to walk, how to handle objects, and so forth, he adjusts himself to his personal, individual destiny. In order to understand man's being in the right way, these things must be viewed from all sides. Now I should like to explain to you, by means of another fact, how the whole of human life is constituted. Let us go back to the sleeping state, to those experiences undergone by us between falling asleep and awaking. Here we go back with our ego and astral body into the spiritual world. We go back to the starting point of our life. Yet the ego and astral body are weaving our future destiny. When the ego and astral body return again to the physical body, then destiny has been woven anew, night by night. Man's ordinary consciousness, however, does not yet know anything of this destiny. He enters again into his physical and etheric bodies. In the etheric body he had left behind his thoughts. We only assume that we do not think while lying in bed. We think unceasingly, but unbeknown to ourselves, because our ego and astral body dwell outside our thoughts. Thinking is an activity of the etheric body. You can easily observe this fact even in everyday life. For instance, you have heard for the first time a symphony that excited you greatly. If you are inclined to wake up during the night, you will do so again and again, always finding yourself amid this symphony's sounds, which continue to vibrate within your etheric body. These vibrations do not cease. It is not necessary that your ego be present while the symphony reverberates within you. If your ego were present, you would be aware only of the etheric body's vibrations. It is the same with other thoughts. You are thinking all night long while lying in bed, since your ego is away. However, you do not know that you think. I can even disclose to you that waking life often spoils our thinking. Generally, our thoughts are much keener when our ego is away at night. This is true whether you believe it or not. Most people's judgment on life is much sounder at night than in the daytime. If the etheric body, which is in harmony with the laws of the universe, thinks by itself, and man does not ruin these thoughts, then man's thinking, no longer muddled up by the ego, as happens so often in the daytime, becomes much sounder. While our ego and astral body are outside our physical and etheric bodies, we are engaged in weaving our future karma. What, as ego and astral body, lives and weaves outside us, between falling asleep and awaking, must pass through the portal of death. It must enter and pass through the supersensible world. It is true that the astral element is subsequently merged with the ego, which thus undergoes a change of substance and must continue its way alone. Yet all that which has been weaving in the sleeping state, outside the physical and etheric bodies, must pass through the portal of death, and must, between death and a new birth, pursue its path across the stages described by me during the recent days. My description has shown you how the ego passes through a stage where it works in unison with the beings of the higher hierarchies, in order to prepare the spiritual germ of a future physical body. This work necessitates the experiencing of profound wisdom between death and a new birth, an experience that can be undergone only if sharing a spiritual activity with beings of the higher hierarchies. Many other things must be merged with the karma, as it is woven between falling asleep and awaking, in order to unite all the elements into a future physical body. For you must consider what kind of path has to be pursued. All that is being woven as karma dwells in the ego and astral body. It must descend into those regions possessed by us in the next earth life as the unconscious will regions. All these elements must be thoroughly blended with our entire bodily organism. During the ordinary sleeping state, the ego and astral body have, as yet, but little of what they must attain during their transition between death and a new birth. From the sleeping state, the ego and astral body must return to the physical body, and when they wake up, they do not quite understand how to deal with this physical body. For having received this body as the result of a previous earth life, they do not know how to immerse themselves into it in the right way. Because the astral body and ego can form the physical and etheric bodies only in the next earth life, working on them in childhood, during the first and second 7-year period, and because the ego and astral body will only then encompass all that can work in the right way on the physical body, therefore now, when the ego, on falling asleep, has just absorbed the human being's moral conduct and karma, I'm going to read that again. That's a long sentence. Because the astral body and ego can form the physical and etheric bodies only in the next earth life, working on them in childhood during the first and second 7-year period, and because the ego and astral body will only then encompass all that can work in the right way on the physical body, therefore now, when the ego, on falling asleep, has just absorbed the human being's moral conduct, and karma has just begun to weave itself, this ego, on awaking, does not rightly understand all the things contained in the physical body. The ego, when again immersing itself in the physical body, is utterly unconscious. Yet as it passes through the region of mental activity, confused dream images arise. What do these signify? Why do they correspond in many cases so little to life? Because the ego and astral body try to immerse themselves in the physical and etheric bodies, but find it difficult to do so. This discrepancy between that which the ego cannot do, but which it should do according to the wise principles of the physical and etheric bodies, this discrepancy is expressed by the confused images dreamed by us just before awaking. These dreams show us pictorially how the ego tries to bring what it has not yet attained into a certain harmony with the physical and etheric body. and only when the ego, suppressing consciousness in regard to the will, immerses itself in subconscious regions, and hence no longer relies upon its own wisdom, can it enter again into the physical body without producing confused mental images. If the ego, on awaking, plunged into the physical body when fully conscious, or half-conscious as in dreams, then the most terrifying dreams would arise from man's entire physical body. Only the circumstance that we plunge at the right moment into the unconscious will subdues the fleeting dream images, and lets us sink down as proper egos and proper astral bodies into the regions of the unconscious will. It is quite clear to anyone looking at these things without prejudice that every dream can show us the disharmony existing in the present life between what the ego and astral body have acquired in this present life and the fully developed physical and etheric bodies. First, that which has been woven as moral element must unite itself during the transition between death and a new birth with the spiritual germ of the physical body. Then whatever has been woven in the present life between falling asleep and awaking becomes so powerful that it is really able to sink down during the next childhood life, during this dreamy, half-asleep childhood life, into the physical and etheric bodies, using them as tools for earth life. We carry within us the result of preceding earth lives. Only all that we carry below in our will organism as forces of the preceding earth life is concealed by an inner fire, which consumes our physical substance and products. Yet these forces, although consumed by fire, are nonetheless active. We pursue our path across the world by means of our karma. There exists an especial path for every single experience. By choosing from childhood on what we want to imitate from the surrounding world, and by doing so, initiating an event that may not occur until our 50th year, and at the same time, by exerting our will for the purpose of bringing about this experience, we undergo within ourselves a combustion of that which is bodily substance. And because the fire renders us unconscious with regard to our life path, our inner perception transposes what is really a continuous course of destiny into something appearing to us like momentary desires, instincts, urges, varieties of temperament, and so forth. Below courses the life path determined by destiny. The fires are always flaming forth anew. We, however, can only see the fire's surface, and on this surface, out of the seething flames, as it were, there comes to life what dwells in our souls as passions, desires, instincts. Here is only the outer semblance, the outer revelation of that which weaves in the depths as human destiny. What men observe are the single passions, the single instincts, the single desires, momentary likes and dislikes, deeds carried out or not carried out because of momentary sympathy or antipathy. In making such observations, however, we behave like someone who has a sentence before him and says, "Here I see Godrulesthereword." All he can do is to spell the single letters. Then another person comes and says, "The letters spelled by you mean God rules the world." Just as spelling differs from reading, so does ordinary science differ from spiritual science. Ordinary psychology is able to spell. By looking at a human life, it finds certain instincts and urges in the child. The scientist, who only knows how to spell, registers these things, and thus it continues during the human being's entire existence on earth. Those understanding spiritual science are able to read. Looking beyond the fire's surface, they see what is below, man's destiny-determined life path. Between ordinary psychology, such as it is still practiced today, and genuine knowledge of human soul life, there is a difference akin to that between spelling and reading. We could make ourselves understood with less difficulty if we could only tell the others that they are wrong. But if someone spells Godrules, it is impossible to tell him what you say is wrong, for it is perfectly correct. Only the other lacking the knowledge that the letters can be combined and read, will say to us, "You are a crazy fellow. All that I can see is G-O-D," and so forth. "It would be utterly foolish to combine the letters," unquote. He cannot understand that we are not only able to spell, but also to read. This fact makes our position very difficult. The anthroposophist could easily reach an understanding with the others. He does not have to refute them. Neither is he entangled into polemics against external science. If this science, however, begins to call him a crazy fellow, then naturally he is forced to state that this is wide of the mark and point out his willingness to consider as valid what the others want to consider as valid. Only he would have to exclude the following principle: whatever this or that person does not see is non-existent. For this principle is no criterion of truth, and those persons who hold to it should first ascertain whether others can see what they themselves cannot see. In view of these things, those standing on anthroposophical ground must be able to fathom this difficult relationship between anthroposophy and other worldviews. At most we could come to the conclusion that the one tolerating nothing but Godrules should be considered as semi-illiterate. Likewise, we might possibly say to the one who could not wean himself of the habit to spell out the single instincts, urges, passions, temperaments, and so forth, quote, "You are a semi-Philistine, a semi-blockhead. The trouble with you is that you cannot soar," unquote. We could not tell him, however, that he was wrong. The issue between anthroposophy and other worldviews is of such nature that no understanding can be reached until those who know only how to spell will have a mind to learn how to read. Otherwise no mutual comprehension is possible, and for this reason all the customary debates lead to no result whatsoever. This fact is noticed by very few opponents of anthroposophy. In my opinion, it is essential that these things should be known to you. The opponents of anthroposophy increase with every month, yet they are unable to find a foothold. For since anthroposophy always agrees with them, but they refuse to agree with anthroposophy, they cannot attack very well what the anthroposophist says. And for this reason they attack his personality, defame it, tell lies about it. Unfortunately, polemics tend more and more toward such a form. This must be envisaged by those standing on anthroposophical ground. You must consider that a very odd assortment of antagonistic books exists nowadays. Many of their authors who have read anthroposophical literature may have found out that I myself, in certain passages of my own books, mention all the objections that could be raised. I engage in polemics against myself in order to show how that which I affirm could be blotted out. Hence all possible objections against anthroposophy can be found in my books. Consequently, many of my opponents busy themselves with copying the arguments which I myself in my own books have cited against anthroposophy. They then distribute these writings to others in order to attack anthroposophy. Thus you can find hostile writings plagiarizing my own books and simply copying my words when I say this or that objection could be raised. The fact that the anthroposophist himself has to point out all the arguments that can be advanced against him makes his opponent's task rather easy. I mention these things not for the purpose of harrowing my opponents, but in order to characterize how one must progress if one desires to read life experiences with regard to the will impulses, instead of merely spelling them out. Spelling only shows us what momentarily wells up in the form of urges of animal life expressed by desires, passions, and wishes. Those able to combine these letters and read them will penetrate every individual human destiny. Let me read that again. Those able to combine these letters and read them will penetrate every individual destiny. This human destiny is working at the source of life, and by means of this destiny the human being joins himself to the ever-continuing course of mankind's whole evolution. And only by comprehending in this way a single human being's entire life are we able to comprehend human history. During the following days we shall contemplate mankind's history, contemplate it as the life of mankind in its destiny before and after the mystery of Golgotha. and we shall also see how the mystery of Golgotha has influenced mankind's development on earth. First, however, I had to erect a foundation and show what is at work within the human being. Only thus can it be recognized in the right way how the gods and the mystery of Golgotha are at work within the individual man, within his entire destiny. The end of Lecture 4. This is Lecture 5 of Man's Being, His Destiny, and World Evolution, a lecture cycle by Rudolf Steiner. We cannot fully estimate the nature of man's being as it appears at present, without fixing our eyes on extended periods through which he has passed in the course of his evolution. This will become evident when considering the facts described by me during recent days. Our souls undergo repeated earth lives that are always separated from one another by the life between death and a new birth. In this manner our souls have passed through the most manifold periods of human evolution. By reflecting on these things, we shall clearly recognize that the nature of the human being can be comprehended only when we consider extended periods during which our souls have repeatedly lived on earth. These matters have been discussed by me in previous Christiania, Oslo lectures, dealing with the sequence of evolutionary epochs, such as those that preceded and those that followed the mystery of Golgotha. Today I wish to discuss this subject from a particular standpoint. Mankind has undergone great changes in the course of its evolution. This fact is not sufficiently appreciated. People know that a Greek period existed, an Egyptian period, and other earlier periods. But although they are aware of evolving culture impulses, they believe that human beings in regard to their soul life were just the same, at least in historic ages, as they are today. This is not true. At a certain stage we come to a stop in this historic retrospect. We come to a long pause, leading to a period which present-day scientists are very fond of describing as that of man's supposedly ape-like ancestors. Mankind's evolution, however, was not in the least as people now imagine it. In order to understand the changes it has undergone, let us envisage the relatively great dependency existing in the present age during the human being's first years of life on the spirit and soul organism, of the spirit and soul organism on the physical bodily one. You need only to consider the stage of early childhood until the change of teeth, and the extensive transformation accompanying the change of teeth, which must strike every unprejudiced observer. The child's entire soul constitution becomes different. We then find another life period lasting until puberty. We all know that at this age the development of spirit and soul is dependent on the development of the body. And if we observe these things without prejudice, we notice the same dependence of spirit and soul on the body also at a later age, lasting until the 20s. Although today, in the time of youth movements, this is not said in a critical sense, it is just the young people who do not like to emphasize this dependence. Naturally, they consider themselves at 16 or 17 fully developed young women and young men, and those vaunting unusual mental faculties write newspaper articles at 21. These young people would thus like to hush up the fact that their spirit and soul is greatly dependent on their bodily organism. At any rate, the present-day human being becomes more or less independent of the body once he has reached a certain age. A man in his 20s is an adult who does not feel himself as dependent upon his body as would a child were it to pass in full consciousness through the stages between change of teeth and puberty. There was still a feeling in comparatively recent ages that the human being matured gradually. It was then clearly realized that the so-called apprentice had to be treated differently from the journeyman, and a master's rank could not be attained until relatively late in life. As regards present-day man, however, it can be asserted that after a certain age, his spirit and soul are no longer greatly dependent on his body. Of course, on reaching a venerable age, we notice a renewed dependence on our physical organism. When the legs become shaky, when the face becomes wrinkled, when the hair becomes grey, we cannot then deny the influence of the body. This, however, is not ascribed to a genuine parallelism of body and soul. People of today feel that even though the bodily forces decline, soul and spirit remain, and must remain, more or less independent of the bodily physical. Yet this is not always the case. If we go back to earlier epochs of mankind's evolution, we find the human being, even in his old age, remaining as intensely dependent on his body as does a child's soul today remain dependent on its body between the change of teeth and puberty. And if we are enabled, not by external history, but by spiritual science, to go back to the first period of evolution after the great Atlantean catastrophe which caused a new configuration of the Earth's continents, we come to what I called in my occult science the primeval Indian epoch. The human being then felt himself, even after having reached his 50s, to be just as dependent on the physical as the child's soul is dependent on the change of teeth, and the youthful person's soul on puberty. This means just as we experience today during childhood the ascending line of growth, so ancient man experienced in his 50s the descending line within spirit and soul. Then things happened in such a way that a man on reaching his 50s matured inwardly just by becoming older, in a similar manner as modern man matures on attaining puberty. And at that time, 7,000 or 8,000 years before the mystery of Golgotha, human beings eagerly looked forward during their whole life to this stage of existence. For everyone could say to himself, "Something will be revealed to me out of my bodily constitution that I could not experience in younger years before I became 49 or 50. Naturally, such an idea is bound to shock modern man most profoundly. You will need to think of a present-day man who is absolutely sure of being a finished product after reaching the 20s. What could be said if he had to wait until the age of maturity revealed something to him which he could not know before, which he could not feel and experience before? In ancient India, however, man's bodily constitution enabled him to feel, already in his 50s, something like a gradual separation of the physical body from spirit and soul. He felt more and more how the physical approximated, as it were, the corpse-like, and he felt in this estrangement of the physical body, in this approach of the physical body to the earth elements, a liberation of spirit and soul. By considering the body merely as a garment, he felt its relationship to the earth, to all that would belong to earth after death. It was less amazing to ancient than to modern men that the body had to be discarded, delivered to the earth forces. For ancient man passed slowly and gradually through this process of discarding the body. This sounds paradoxical because it implies the terrifying conception of having a physical body that is slowly becoming a corpse. Ancient man, however, did not think of his body as a burdensome object passing, as it were, into a kind of putrefaction. Instead, he thought of it as an independent sheath or shell, which, even though becoming earth-like, was yet full of life. Yet the physical body at the age of 50 assumed a sheath-like, shell-like character. This gradual becoming similar to the earth, let me read that again, this gradual becoming similar to the earth taught ancient man something that can be known today only through abstract science. The inner nature of metals, for instance, became known to him. At the age of 50, he was instinctively able to differentiate between copper, silver, and gold. He felt the resemblance of these metals to his own organism gradually turning to earth. A rock crystal called forth in him other feelings than furrowed soil. By aging, man gained wisdom concerning terrestrial matters. This fact influenced primeval civilization. The young, looking up to the old, said to themselves, "These ancients are wise. Once I have become as old as they are, I shall also be wise." Such an attitude caused a profound veneration and a tremendous respect for old age. In those ancient days of mankind's evolution, the epoch of primeval India, A lofty civilization, connected with a wondrous veneration, a wondrous respect for old age, existed in a certain part of the world, not in that part, however, inhabited by men with receding foreheads, such as are excavated today by anthropologists. And we must ask ourselves, how did it actually happen that men passed through these experiences? It did happen because primeval man lived less intensively in his physical body than we do. Today man crawls into the very core of his physical body, the experiences of which he shares. Thus he feels himself to be identical, at one with his physical body. And we must undergo a common destiny with whatever is felt to be at one with us. Because in those ancient times men felt themselves more self-dependent within the physical body, because their thinking was more imaginative, because their feeling was like an inward weaving and living in the world of reality, for all these reasons their physical body from the beginning seemed to them like a sheath in which they were encased. This sheath began to harden as life drew near its end. A man in his 50s could feel how the body developed increasingly in accord with the outer world, thus becoming a mediator that could instill in him wisdom concerning the outer world. The situation changed when civilized mankind of those days passed into the next age, called by me in my occult science the primeval Persian. Then a man in his 50s could no longer experience this dependence of his physical body upon the earthly. Instead, the aging physical body exerted a different influence on those still in their 40s, from the 42nd or 43rd year to the 49th or 50th. During these years they participated intensively in the change of seasons. They experienced spring, summer, autumn, winter within their body. As it were, their body began to bud and blossom during spring and summer, and went into decline during autumn and winter. Human life took part in the seasons, the changing air currents. And this perception of the changing air currents, the changing seasons, was connected with another thing. Man felt that his speech was being transformed into something no longer belonging essentially to him. Just as the primeval Indian felt that once he had attained the 50s, his whole physical body did not really belong to him, but more or less to the earth, so the primeval Persian felt that the body, by producing speech, belonged to the people around him. At 50, a member of primeval Indian culture no longer said, "I am walking." If expressing his own feelings, he would say, "My body is walking." He did not say, "I enter through the door," but instead, "My body carries me through the door." For he experienced his body as something related to the outer world, to the earth. And 5 or 6 millennia before the mystery of Golgotha, a member of the Persian civilization felt that speech came forth by itself, that he had it in common with his whole surroundings. At that time, people all over the world did not live in such an international way as today, but as members of definite folk communities. They felt how speech became alienated from them, how, if expressing their real feelings, they could say, "It is speaking within me." It was really the case that people, after attaining the 40s, expressed the following in a certain very respectful sense: "Divine spiritual forces are speaking through me." And the human being also felt as if his breath did not belong to him any longer, but was dedicated to the surrounding world. On reaching his late 30s, a member of the Egypto-Chaldean culture, which lasted from the 3rd or 4th millennium until the 8th or 9th pre-Christian century, had a similar feeling with regard to his thoughts, his mental images. The Egyptian or Chaldean felt in his 35th year as if his mental images were connected with heavenly forces, the course of the stars. As the primeval Indian at the end of his life felt the connection of his body with the earth, as the primeval Persian felt the connection of his speech, his breath, with the seasons and the surrounding world, so a member of ancient Egyptian, of ancient Chaldean culture felt that his thoughts were directed by the course of the stars, and he felt how divine star powers were interwoven with his thoughts. In Egypto-Chaldean culture, the human being felt this dependence of his thoughts upon heavenly powers until his 42nd or 43rd year. Subsequently, no new element entered into human development. The primeval Persian, too, felt as if his thoughts had been given to him by the stars, but he attained, moreover, in his 40s, the relationship to speech that I have described. Likewise, the primeval Indian, from his 35th year, possessed this relationship to the star powers. Therefore he considered astrology as something self-evident. In his 40s he also attained the dependence of speech upon his surroundings. In his 50s, moreover, he experienced how his physical body became objective, became shadow-like. He accustomed himself, as it were, to the dying, because dying had approached him already in his 50s. The soul was less firmly joined to the body. Hence outer conditions could bring forth these bodily changes. This fact was perceived by the soul, experienced by the soul, and thereby man, as he grew older, merged himself more and more with the world. Then came the Greco-Latin era, which lasted from the 8th pre-Christian century until the 15th post-Christian century, for until then the echo of Greco-Latin culture still resounded in all civilized countries. This marked the age when man felt himself, until his 30s, still dependent upon his physical body, but no longer dependent on the stars, the seasons, the earth. He felt himself firmly entrenched within his physical body. The Greek felt a concord, a harmony between the soul and spirit element and the bodily physical. Only this bodily physical element no longer separated itself from him. This is all very difficult to express, for we are prevented by the customary and totally inadequate historical teaching given to us in school from forming a conception of these changes in mankind's evolution. There then came the time when the human being became connected with his physical body in such a way that his physical body was committed no longer to participate in the course of the universe directed by spiritual laws. Now man was completely bound to his physical body. Mankind did not reach this stage until the 8th pre-Christian century. Thus a great transformation of mankind's whole evolution occurred, in as far as it concerned civilized mankind. Although the human being, on reaching the 30s, still felt himself still at one with his physical body, he no longer was separated from it. He felt himself united with his physical body. It could no longer unveil to him the world's mysteries. During this period, therefore, mankind attained an entirely new relation to death. At an earlier time, when the human being prepared himself for dying, as it were, by undergoing a separation from his physical body, this dying signified for him nothing but a transformation in the midst of life. For in his 50s he became familiar gradually with the process of dying. He experienced dying as a process which merged him in a wisdom-filled and blissful way with the universe. He experienced death as something guiding him into a world in which he had already lived during his earth life. Death at that time was something entirely different from what it became later. It might be said more and more the human being was confronted by the possibility that soul and spirit might participate in death. Let us compare Hellenism with the primeval Indian epoch. In primeval India, the body gained independence. The individual was aware of being something else besides his body, which became independent and sheath-like. He could not have possibly conceived the thought that death might be the end. Such a thought did not exist among human beings of the primeval Indian period. Only by degrees, and most decisively in the 8th pre-Christian century, did man say to himself, still out of an unconscious feeling, because he was unable to think about these things in a rationalistic way, my body dies, but with regard to soul and spirit, I am at one with my body. No longer did he notice the difference between the bodily and the spirit and soul element. The human being became dominated by a thought that terrified him when it first arose out of dark spiritual depths in the 9th or 8th century before the mystery of Golgotha. It was the thought, might not my soul pursue the same path as my body, die as my body dies? This thought, which in the primeval Indian epoch would have been totally inconceivable, now came more and more to the fore. Out of this mood emerged words like those famous ones of the Greek hero, "Better a beggar in the upper world than a king in the realm of the shades." This was the time when mankind nurtured a mood that grew in the right way toward the mystery of Golgotha. For what brought forth in ancient human beings the ability to preserve a freshness of soul, which made it impossible for them to conceive that the soul might take the same path of death as the body? Question. This freshness of soul, this independence of soul with regard to feeling, was given to ancient man by this knowledge: I have had a life, for he could look into this life, which was pre-earthly. Through it I passed with my soul and spirit before I descended to the physical world. While dwelling in this higher world, I was united with the exalted Sun-being. The ancient mysteries had evolved a teaching which pointed out that man in his pre-earthly existence was united with the spirit of the sun, just as in earth life his body is united with the physical light of the sun. The teachers in the ancient mysteries told the following to their pupils, who in their turn told it again to others. They did not designate the exalted Sun-being as the Christ, but he was the Christ, and we may therefore be permitted today to use this name. They said, "The Christ is a being who shall never descend to the earth. You, however, dwelt in your pre-earthly existence before descending to earth within spiritual worlds in communion with the Christ, and the force of the Christ has given you the faculty of making your soul independent of the body." This instinctive memory of a pre-earthly existence was lost through the soul's increasing identification with its physical body. And in the Greek epoch, earthly man could employ his instinctive consciousness forces only by looking at physical life. The Greek was able to live such a harmonious earth life because his outlook into the divine worlds of the spirit had faded away. He was so successful in subduing the sensible physical that the spiritual vanished more or less from his life's horizon. No longer did civilized men have a consciousness of the fact that before descending to earth they dwelt in the presence of the exalted Sun-being, who was later called the Christ. Now darkness encompassed those who looked at pre-earthly, prenatal existence, and thus arose the mystery of death. What happened henceforth must be envisaged as something concerning not only mankind, but also the gods. The divine spiritual powers who sent the human being down to earth gave him the impulses toward the development that I have just described. Since his spirit and soul became increasingly merged with the physical body, since, as it were, his spirit and soul became identical with the physical, and since, therefore, the mystery of death confronted also the spirit and soul, the divine spiritual powers who had sent the human being down to earth, were threatened with the danger that he might be lost to the gods, that his soul as well as his body might die. Yet man would never have become a free, independent being had he not grown into his body during this epoch. Man could only become free in evolution if his view of the pre-earthly was dimmed. He was obliged to stand on earth, totally forsaken, as it were, within his physical body's abode. Thus his independent ego could radiate and gleam up. For this shining forth of the independent ego can be best accomplished by the human being entering completely into his physical body. When man grows upward into the worlds of spirit and soul, his ego retreats. He is being merged with the objective element of spirit and soul. Man could become a free ego being only if given the impulse by the gods to merge himself more and more with his physical body. He was thus, however, confronted by the mystery of death, for the physical body was bound to be claimed by death. Now, if man's vision had not been awakened in another way, all of mankind on earth would have become more and more convinced that the soul and physical body were both dying together. And if nothing else had happened, if history had continued its course in a straight line, all of us today would have come to the common conviction that the soul as well as the body are doomed to be laid in the grave. At this point, the divine spiritual powers decided to send down on earth the exalted Sun-being, the Christ, in order that men who no longer had any knowledge of their communion with the Christ during pre-earthly existence could gain consciousness of their communion with the Christ after he had descended on earth and had shared on Golgotha and in Palestine their human destiny in the body of Jesus of Nazareth. The God descended into the earthly world at the moment of mankind's world historic evolution, when men had lost their feeling of communion with the Son being beyond the earthly world. Why did the Christ come down on earth? Because human beings, having fought their way to the attainment of complete ego consciousness, needed him on earth. Men had to experience the presence of a victor who could die and resurrect himself, be the vanquisher of death. In the course of history, this mystery had to be set before mankind at a time when man, no longer able to look back into the pre-earthly existence, was granted a view of his communion with the giver of man's immortality, with the Christ. It is a divine event, and not merely for mankind, that the Christ was sent down on earth from higher worlds. For the human race would have fallen away from the gods, had they not sent down upon earth the loftiest among them, in order that he undergo a human destiny, a human existence, thus interweaving a divine event with earthly human events and mankind's entire world evolution. The mystery of Golgotha cannot be comprehended unless we regard it not only as a human event, but also as a divine event. The fact must be grasped that something which could be envisaged previously only in the divine worlds could now be envisaged in the earthly world. Possibly you might raise the objection, not all men have become followers of the Christ. Many do not believe in the Christ. Must all these have the opinion that at death their soul would be laid in the grave with the body? This, however, is not the way in which the mystery of Golgotha may be interpreted. It is valid through all the centuries preceding ours that the Christ, in his infinite compassion, overflowing with grace, died not only for his immediate followers, but for all men in all ages, everywhere on earth. All men on earth have been redeemed from the riddle of death by the Christ. At first, this deed did not touch human consciousness. It is natural, however, that some men were found who could consciously grasp the grandeur and significance of the mystery of Golgotha. Yet the Christ did die and did rise, as much for the Chinese, Japanese, and Hindus as for the Christians. Just because, since the 15th century, human evolution must increasingly regard intellectualism as its highest soul force, and just because this intellectual impulse will become more and more powerful in the future, have we approached an epoch when it is incumbent upon the earth's entire population to grasp, with its ever-growing consciousness, what was brought forth by the mystery of Golgotha. Thus it will become necessary that the mystery of Golgotha be penetrated by a knowledge that can be really understood by all men on earth. In preceding centuries, Christianity developed in a way that still conformed to the peculiarities of ancient ethnic religions. Christian development had not yet attained universality. The Christian missionaries who went among the followers of other religions found little or no understanding, because the Christ was presented as a separate God, who had the same qualities as those possessed by the ancient heathen folk deities. This was the manner in which Christianity had been disseminated. Why had Constantine, why Chlodwig accepted Christianity? Because they believed that the Christian God would be a more powerful helper than their former gods. They exchanged, as it were, their former gods for the Christian God. Hence the Christ had to take on many qualities of the ancient folk deities. These qualities have adhered to the Christ through the centuries. In this way, however, Christianity could not become a universal religion. On the contrary, it had to retreat more and more before intellectualism. And we have seen, particularly in the 19th century, many a theological development which understood nothing whatsoever of the Christ event in its supersensible aspect. Here the desire was to speak only of Jesus, the man, although conceding that as man he towered above all other men. Yet henceforth the desire was only to speak of Jesus, the man, and not of Christ the God. We must nevertheless be able to speak again of Christ the God, because this Christ, while undergoing his destiny through the mystery of Golgotha, manifested to men on earth what he had formerly signified to them, before they had descended to earth from the high heavens. Hence we must state that the ancient folk religions were primarily local religions. People prayed to the god of Thebes, to the god on Mount Olympus. They were local deities who could be worshipped only in nearby places. Thus from the beginning these ancient faiths were bound to certain territories. Later the local gods, who had their abode in a definite spot, were replaced by gods bound to the personalities of single men, of the guiding folk heroes. Yet a people's god was either a still living folk hero or his surviving soul, the ancestral folk soul. All religious faiths had a restricted character. With Christianity, however, there appeared a world religion which bestowed a spiritual element upon the whole earth, just as the sun bestows a physical element upon the whole earth. Sun, S-U-N. The climate in the vicinity of Mount Olympus is different from the climate in the vicinity of Thebes. The latter, in its turn, is different from the climate in the vicinity of Bombay. If a religious faith nestles close to a locality, it cannot spread beyond this locality. The sun, however, sheds its light on all the earth's localities, shines upon all men as the same sun. When, however, the human form was taken on by that God whose physical reflection shone forth in the sun's radiance, then the human race received a God who could be accepted as God by all men on earth. If the possibility is found of penetrating the being of this Christ divinity, we shall be able to represent him as the God acceptable to all mankind. Today we stand only at the beginning of anthroposophical teachings. As it were, we are still stammering the language of anthroposophy. Yet anthroposophy will continue to develop more and more, and a part of this development will consist in its capability of finding words to describe the mystery of Golgotha. Words of a kind that spiritual science can bring to the Hindus, the Chinese, to all men on earth, and which will elucidate the mystery of Golgotha in such a way that the Hindus, the Chinese, the Japanese will be unable to reject what is told them concerning the mystery of Golgotha. For this purpose we must attach a genuinely serious significance to all that represents Christian tradition. Throughout the centuries, people have subjected themselves more or less to the words of the Gospels. They have studied these Gospels in a way commensurate with their understanding of these ancient books. We have certainly no intention of speaking against the validity of the Gospels. Our cycles on each of the Gospels attempt to penetrate by means of special anthroposophical interpretation into the deeper meaning of these Gospels. Yet one thing must be said. Why is the passage at the end of one Gospel taken so lightly? There it is written, quote, "I have still many things to say unto you, but ye cannot bear them now." Unquote. And why are the words of another Gospel not taken more seriously? Quote, "And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the earth cycles." Unquote. For the Christ spoke the full truth. He could have said to men other things than those recorded in the Gospels. Only those Christ words are recorded in the Gospels, for the understanding of which the men of that epoch, few in number, were ready. But mankind must become more and more mature in the course of earthly evolution. From the mystery of Golgotha on, the Christ dwelt among men as the living Christ, and not as the dead Christ, and he is still present among us. If we learn to speak his language, we shall recognize his presence. We shall recognize the truth of his words, quote, "And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the earth cycles." Unquote. And the anthroposophical worldview desires to speak his language, his spiritual language. The anthroposophical worldview desires to speak in such a way of nature, of all the beings on earth, of the starry sky and the sun, that by means of this language the mystery of Golgotha may be understood, that the Christ may be experienced as the one who is ever present. And also after the mystery of Golgotha, we may regard as Christ's words all that we have gained from the spiritual world, aided by that power which through the mystery of Golgotha descended from heaven to earth. If as men we speak of the spiritual worlds, we may make true the word of St. Paul, "Not I, but the Christ in me." For today we have entered an age in which we cannot even emulate the Greeks, who, although feeling themselves still at one with their physical body, yet felt this physical body as something harmonious and independent. Today we penetrate at a still earlier age than the Greeks into that which underlies our physical body, thus separating ourselves from the spiritual around us. We can deepen our being only by seeking the union with the God who descended from heaven to earth, and we can feel ourselves united only with that God who entered the earthly sphere, because men on earth could no longer enter the heavenly sphere with their immediate and ordinary consciousness. By finding the Christ, we also find anew the approach to the supersensible world. Not now, however, by means of the physical body. This was the case in ancient times, but by means of heightened soul power. And today, when the parallelism between the development of body and soul lasts only up to the age of 20, later on it will last a still shorter period, this heightened soul power can be attained alone by immersing ourselves in the midst of the sensible events of earthly evolution into the knowledge of a supersensible event, the mystery of Golgotha. Everything on earth took place in a sensible way. Only in the mystery of Golgotha something supersensible mingled with earthly events, and this can be understood only out of a supersensible knowledge. Hence the union with the Christ awakens in our human souls the powerful faculty of attaining a relationship to the supersensible world, a relationship formerly attained by human beings through being connected with their physical body in such a way that the body could become sheath-like. Thus, feeling the approach of death before physical death occurred, they merged themselves with the spirit prevailing in their surroundings. We must attain by means of the soul what could be attained in earlier days through the mediation of the body. For although we admire in the highest degree what has been preserved of Indian writings, which did not originate, however, from the earliest primeval Indian epoch, but from a later period, although we admire what has been bequeathed to us through the glory of the Vedas, the grandeur of the Vedanta philosophy, the radiant splendor of the Bhagavad Gita, we must nevertheless recognize the fact that this could be attained in ancient times only, because the body reflected to the human being, as he grew older, a certain spirituality. Ancient man was compensated for the waning of his physical existence, which set in after the 35th year, by having, as it were, the spirit pressing out of his body, as the latter became hard, withered, and wrinkled. And this spirit was perceived by the human being. The great philosophical poems of ancient times were not composed by youths, but by patriarchs who had acquired wisdom. It resulted from what was given by the body. In the present stage of human evolution, which differs from the ancient ones, we must receive from the soul, as it grows more powerful, what was formerly contributed by the body. Our body becomes old. We must remain united with it. We cannot let the spirit emerge from this body because we have utilized it since early childhood. If we did not do this, we could never be free men. This must be accepted as our rightful earthly destiny. One fact, however, must be made clear to us. Our soul has to gain strength. Since the spiritual strength formerly corresponding to the waning body flows to us no longer, we must attain it by strengthening our soul through our own effort. And we shall experience this strengthening of the soul by looking in a genuine and living way toward a great and powerful event, the divine event that took place as the mystery of Golgotha in the midst of earthly life. In beholding the mystery of Golgotha, and becoming conscious that its after effect is still dwelling among us, is still existing in the spiritual supersensible sphere, our spirit and soul become strengthened and approach the spiritual world anew. The Christ has descended to earth in order that men who no longer see him in heaven by means of their memory may be permitted to see him on earth. Seen from today's viewpoint, this is what rightly places the mystery of Golgotha before our spiritual eye. The disciples who had preserved a remnant of ancient clairvoyance could still have the Christ as their teacher when he dwelt among them after the resurrection in the spiritual body. Yet this power gradually fell away from them, and its complete disappearance is symbolically represented through the festival of the Ascension. The disciples sank into profound sadness, because they were forced to believe that the Christ was no longer among them. They had taken part in the event of Golgotha. Now, however, they had to believe that the Christ had moved away from their consciousness, that the Christ was no longer on earth. Thus they were plunged into deep sorrow, for they had seen the Christ figure disappear in the clouds, that is, move away from their consciousness. But every genuine knowledge is born out of sorrow, of suffering, of grief. True, profound knowledge is never born out of joy. True, profound knowledge is born out of suffering. And out of the suffering which encompassed the disciples of the Christ at the festival of the Ascension, out of this deep soul anguish arose the mystery of Pentecost. The disciples could no longer view the Christ by means of their outer instinctive clairvoyance, but the force of the Christ unfolded within them. The Christ had sent to them the Spirit, enabling their soul to experience the Christ event in their innermost depths. This experience gave meaning to the first festival of Pentecost occurring in human evolution. The Christ, who had disappeared from the outer clairvoyant view, still clinging to the disciples as a heritage of ancient evolutionary periods, appeared at Pentecost within the disciples' inner experience. The fiery tongues signify nothing but the arising of the inner Christ in the souls of his pupils, the souls of the disciples. Out of inner necessity, the festival of Pentecost had to follow the festival of the Ascension. The end of Lecture 5. This is the sixth and last lecture of Man's Being, His Destiny, and World Evolution, lecture cycle by Rudolf Steiner, given at Christiania, Oslo, May 16th to the 21st, 1923. Lecture 6. In looking back at the considerations set forth here during the last few days, we shall see on the one hand, standing there before our soul, the relations existing between the individual man and the universe, and on the other, the relations existing between a single human being living at a certain time and mankind's whole earthly development. Today I should like to round out these considerations by adding a few thoughts. You will have inferred from what was said that the human being in ancient times preceding the mystery of Golgotha stood much closer than we do today to outward nature, to the external world. This statement goes counter to the present-day belief that we, by means of our science, stand extremely close to nature. We do nothing of the kind. We have intellectual thoughts on nature, drawn only from external observation, but we no longer experience nature. Had the human being remained dependent on the spiritual element in nature, he would not have become the free being into which he developed during the recent stages of historical evolution. He would not have attained his full ego consciousness. If today we look into our own self, into that which we carry within us as the memory images of things experienced by us previously, what do we find in ourselves, and rightly so? We find our ego with all its experiences. When ancient man, living several millennia before the mystery of Golgotha, looked into himself, he did not find his ego. He did not say, quote, I have experienced this or that 10 or 20 years ago, unquote. Just by means of his memory it was clear to him that he had to say, quote, the gods let me have this or that experience, unquote. And he did not say, quote, the ego within me had this or that experience, unquote, but, quote, the God within me had the experience, unquote. It was just because the human being participated spiritually by means of his physical body, his etheric body, his astral body, and the processes of nature outside of himself, just because he stood in a closer, more intimate relationship to nature, he could say, quote, the God within me experiences the world, unquote. Today man acquires a knowledge of nature by means of his intellect. His knowledge is concerned exclusively with dead nature. Thus he has become able to speak of himself out of his innermost feeling as an ego, to be a free ego being. This was felt with especial strength by Paul when passing through the event of Damascus. For Paul, before passing through the event of Damascus, was an initiate in the sense of ancient initiation. He had learned in the Semitic wisdom schools of those days that the God whom one might justifiably call the Christ could be seen only in pre-earthly existence. This he had been told in the wisdom schools. The disciples and pupils of the Christ, however, whom he came to know, made the following assertion, quote, "The Christ has dwelt among us within the man Jesus of Nazareth. He was here on earth. While we were his contemporaries, we experienced him not only in our memory going back to a pre-earthly existence, but here, on earth itself." Unquote. And Paul answered out of his initiatory knowledge, quote, "That is impossible, for the Christ can be seen only in pre-earthly existence." Unquote. And he was an unbeliever, persecuting Christianity until the vision, the imagination of Damascus revealed this to him. The Christ now lives in connection with the earth. Then he, Paul, coined the expression which has since become so significant for inner Christianity, quote, "Not I, but the Christ in me." Unquote. Man can recognize his ego in a natural way. He simply needs to look into himself. But in order to reach God anew, he must unite himself in full consciousness with the mystery of Golgotha and say to himself, "The Christ in me." The men of ancient times have said, quote, "We were together with the Christ and hence with God the Father before descending to earth." Unquote. Now they had to say, quote, "The Christ is on earth." Unquote. Physically, Christ was on earth during the mystery of Golgotha. Spiritually, he has, since the mystery of Golgotha, remained united with all men on earth. Such knowledge is also contained in Christianity. We are told that the Christ revealed to man that the kingdom of heaven has come near. Yet just the interpretation of this word shows clearly that the human beings, although outwardly believing, are inwardly unbelieving. You need only consider what many modern theologians have to say about this coming near of the kingdom of heaven. They say, quote, "Well, in this respect, the Christ depended on the judgment of his age. Then people believed that the earth would become more spiritual at a certain time. Here the Christ was mistaken." Unquote. It is not the Christ, however, who was mistaken. Human beings were mistaken. They have interpreted these words in such a way as though the kingdom of heaven by coming near would make the grapes grow 10 times larger and let the earth overflow with milk and honey. Such was not the meaning of what the Christ said. The Christ spoke of the kingdom of the Spirit which he had brought near. It is not allowable to say, quote, "What the Christ told us was a mistake. Today we must think differently." Unquote. Instead of this, we should ask ourselves, quote, "How can I understand what the Christ has said?" Unquote. Since the mystery of Golgotha, it has indeed become more and more necessary for us to find the spiritual within the earthly, and perceive the truth of the saying, quote, "The spiritual worlds are descended to the earth." Unquote. They are descended. We need only to look for the path upon which they can be found. In order that we find something of that which leads toward this path, I would like to discuss once more certain points that are apt to bring about a better comprehension of these matters. In those ancient times, when men in their 50s felt the paralysis of their physical body setting in, it was still possible to recognize individual destinies by means of the stars. Since then, every sort of astrological calculation has become the practice of amateurs. The ancient human being felt himself related to the transformation of his physical body into the earthly element. But this transformation of the physical body into the earthly element, this perception of the earth by means of the physical body, enabled him to recognize in the course of the stars the spiritual element within destiny. Thus, thousands of years before the mystery of Golgotha, the wisdom of the stars was highly estimated. Then came the age during which, as I have told you, the human being acquired a greater feeling for his surroundings. After reaching the 40s, he felt language in such a way that he could say, quote, "Within me the folk spirit, the folk genius is speaking." Unquote. Man learned to regard language as something objective. In connection with this feeling, the human being experienced that which rotated around him, as it were, in a circle. At a later time, he still experienced the daily sunrise, the daily sunset. To a certain extent, he arranged his life in accord with these phenomena. The course of the year, however, was no longer really understood by him. Yet there was a time during the 6th, 5th, and 4th millennium before the mystery of Golgotha, when men lived in unison not only with day and night, but also with the year. This unison with the year has been partly preserved, especially up here in the north. For instance, a relic of this past unison can still be felt in the Olaf saga, where Olaf experiences the course of the year in such a way that around and after Christmas he enters the life of the spiritual world. Here appears a memory of the unison between human life and the course of the year as it came to flower in very ancient times in the Orient, which was the scene of mankind's loftiest civilization. At that time, human beings understood what later became known to them only by means of tradition, namely how to arrange their festivals in accord with the course of the year. They took part in the course of the year. In what way was this accomplished? Today we have no immediate experience of the fact that we breathe in and breathe out, that the air is alternately within and without us. The present-day human being would be hardly aware of these things were he not told by science. He does not experience so vividly as did the people of ancient times the process of inspiration and expiration. Yet it is not only man that breathes, but also, even though in a different way, our earth. Just as man possesses a soul element, so does the earth possess a soul element. In the course of 1 year, the earth first breathes in and then breathes out her soul element. And the wintry days, during which the Christmas festival takes place, approach at a time when the earth's breathing in process is at its height, when the earth's soul is entirely within the earth. Then the earth has the greatest amount of soul life within herself. Hence, at this time, the spirit and soul element become visible in the earth. If we can inwardly experience how the earth, having concluded this breathing in process, is now inhabited by her whole soul, and thereby lets come out of the earth element the elemental beings who live with the snow-covered trees, who live with the earth's surface, where the water congeals at a time when the earth covers herself with a blanket of ice, if we can inwardly experience all this, then the spiritual beings within the earth begin to stir. The mere naturalist would say, the husbandman scatters the seed, which lies in the earth all winter and sprouts forth in the spring. This, however, could not happen unless the elemental beings preserved during the winter the spiritual force of the seeds. The spiritual beings, the spirits of nature, are most wakeful when the earth has breathed in during the winter time, during the Christmas time, her whole soul. Thus the birth of Jesus could be best understood through the fact that it took place at Christmas, when the earth is inhabited by her entire soul. Yet even at the time of the mystery of Golgotha, there were very few people who had been able to retain an understanding of this spirit and soul element contained in the earth during winter. Men of earlier ages, however, knew that in midsummer, around the day of St. John, on the 24th of June, the state of the earth is just the opposite to her wintry state. In midsummer, the process of exhaling is at its height. Then the earth has given her soul to the extraterrestrial cosmos. From Christmas until the day of St. John, this breathing out of the soul element into the vast universe is perceived more and more. The soul of the earth is striving toward the stars. The soul of the earth wishes to know something about the life of the stars. And in its own way, the soul of the earth is most firmly united through the light of the summer sun with the star movements at the season of St. John's Day. All this could be recognized thousands of years before the mystery of Golgotha in certain parts of the world, and out of this knowledge arose the inception of summer mysteries. In the midsummer mysteries, the mysteries of St. John that were celebrated, especially in the north, the pupils of initiates, under the guidance of these initiates, tried to accompany the earth soul to the vast expanse of the stars, in order to read out of the stars what spiritual happenings and facts were connected with the earth. And during the time between Christmas and the day of St. John, they pursued this soaring of the earth soul toward the world of the stars, this striving of the earth soul toward the stars. And an echo, but only a traditional echo, of this striving of the earth soul toward the stars is still to be found in the way the date for the Easter festival is set. The Easter festival is set for the first Sunday following the vernal sun-moon. The Easter festival is set for the first Sunday following the vernal full moon, and thus takes place in conformity with the stars. The reason for this must be sought in ancient times, when it was said, "The soul of man desires to follow the earth soul on her path to the stars, and consider the star wisdom as something whereby man may be guided." Thus the spring festival, the Easter festival, was set not according to earthly calculation, but according to heavenly calculation, to star calculation. Especially in the span of time between the 8th pre-Christian century and the 4th post-Christian century, the feeling prevailed in the folk souls of civilized people that human beings were saddened by mankind's cosmic destiny. For there still existed the longing to follow the earth soul, which desired to soar up to the stars in springtime. But the human soul, which was tied to the body, could do so no longer. There was no possibility of gaining from nature the ability to soar upward to the world of stars, such as it had existed in ancient times. Human beings, therefore, could easily comprehend why the Easter festival, which was to celebrate the Christ's death and resurrection, should occur just in springtime. And the deity came to their aid by letting the death of Christ Jesus occur in the spring. Even the setting of the Easter festival, however, revealed the fact that it was not permissible to use earthly calculations. The Christmas festival could be computed by earthly means, for then the world soul was inhabiting the earth. Thus the Christmas festival had to be set for a definite day. This setting of the Easter festival contains profound wisdom. Yet the modern age thinks differently. About 24 years ago I had weekly meetings with a well-known astronomer. Our meetings took place in a small circle of friends. This astronomer could reason only in the following way. All the account books of the earth are thrown into disorder by having the Easter festival take place on different days. According to his opinion, the least one could do was to set the Easter festival for the first Sunday in April, or regulate the date in some abstract way. As you know, a movement exists in the world which strives for such an abstract regulation of the Easter festival. People want to have order in their debits and credits, which play such an important part in modern life. And now the Easter festival, whose celebration after all requires several days, causes a great deal of disorder. It would be much more efficient to set one definite day of the year for its observance. These things are an outward symbol of the fact that people want to banish from the world all that conforms to spiritual standards. Here is preeminently shown that we have become materialists who want to banish the spiritual more and more from human existence. Formerly, however, the human being experienced the course of the year in such a way that by accompanying the earth soul into the cosmos in springtime and around the time of St. John's Day, he also learned every year how to follow the spiritual entities of the higher hierarchies, and above all the human souls who had passed out of this world. In ancient times, people were conscious of the fact that by experiencing the course of the year, they learned how to follow the souls of the dead, learned to find out, as it were, how their dead kinfolk were faring. And people felt that springtime not only brought them the first blossoms, but also the opportunity of discovering how their kinfolk were faring. Something spiritual was united in a very concrete way with this experiencing of the seasons. And people in ancient times were much concerned with that which is connected with the earthly element, to the degree that the earthly is influenced by the stars. All this, however, has been outgrown by modern man. When we observe St. John's Day, the time when we could accompany the earth soul soaring upward to unite itself with the stars, the antipodes celebrate Christmas. Thus in that part of the world the earth soul retires into the earth. You must consider that human beings during ancient spiritualized times knew so little of the antipodes that the earth was thought of as a disk. Therefore it was impossible to have any relation to the antipodes. By learning to think of the earth as a rounded body, one became independent of the course of the year. As long as one lived in a restricted region, the course of the seasons was an absolute fact. Today, when one travels across the globe without hindrance, and entering different localities minimizes the incidence of the seasons, one is unable to experience their course. One also lacks the former, intensive relation to the festivals. you will realize how much less concrete and much more abstract our festivals have become. People know by tradition that Christmas is the time for exchanging presents, and besides, children enjoy their few days' vacation. At Easter, one or the other ritual may be witnessed. But in what way do present-day people concretely experience the spiritual world by means of the seasons? Today we are unable to understand the connection between our festivals of the year and the course of the seasons. Not only the human being has, in regard to his own person, become an ego being, a free being, but also the earth has emancipated herself from the universe. In modern times, the earth stands no longer in so close a relation to the universe as was formerly the case, at least as far as mankind's evolution is concerned. Hence man has become increasingly obliged to seek in his inner being what he cannot find outside. As men become more and more intellectual, they acquired a natural science concerned with all that is outside of man. What I have in mind is not physics or chemistry, which in a purely external sense are concerned only with what lies outside of man. I am speaking of biology. This science occupies itself in an intensive way with the lower and also the higher animals, right up to the very highest species. And we have attained to a marvelous, admirable science in regard to the animal world and animal form, so that we are able today to have conceptions of how one animal form has developed out of another. Out of this grew the Darwin-Haeckel conception that the human form has developed out of the animal form. Yet this theory teaches us extraordinarily little about our own nature. It only marks the end of a zoological line. The human being does not attain a knowledge of himself as man, but only as the highest animal. This is a great scientific accomplishment, but it must be interpreted in the right way. People must learn to concede that science can only teach us what man is not. As soon as it has become general knowledge that science must concern itself not with what man is, but with what man is not, then science will become enlightened. Then we shall be able to study all the forms living in the animal kingdom, as well as those in the plant kingdom. Then we shall be able to say, quote, there outside we have all the animal shapes. These we had to leave behind in the outer world, for if they were still within us, we could never have become men. Natural science tells us of the things that we had to conquer within ourselves. We evolved by discarding more and more the natural forms, by ejecting them, and retaining that which is not nature, but which pertains to spirit and soul. Unquote. Man must come to the point where he can address science in the following way. Quote, you are great, for you have taught me what man is not. Hence I must look for man's being in a sphere totally different from external physical science. I can become a true scientist only by recognizing that man is not a product of nature, topping the line of animals, but that the animals are formations cast off and left behind by man. Only thus can I attain a correct relation to science. Unquote. In order to speak such words, man will be compelled to recognize things now not through external observation, but out of his inner nature. And at the moment when man is able to say to himself, quote, science is in the modern sense does not inform us about man, but it only informs us concerning what man is not. Unquote. Let me read that again. Quote, science in the modern sense does not inform us about man, but it only informs us concerning what man is not. Unquote. At this moment it will be recognized how much the world has need of spiritual science. For there is nothing else that gives us the possibility of recognizing man as man. Without spiritual science, we can come to know only the external sheath of man as the final product of the animal kingdom. Just by standing correctly on natural scientific ground, we may fully appreciate natural science as something lying outside of man. To attain a knowledge of man, also with regard to his physical attributes, we must pursue a different path. Anthroposophy has to strive for this spiritual observation. I shall demonstrate this fact by a few concrete examples. Because we are influenced by the materialistic spirit of the age, there is a tendency in our schools to educate children by pointing to their bodily nature. Nowadays people make experiments involving the memory, even the faculties of willing and thinking. I do not object to such things, which may be quite interesting, inasmuch as science is concerned. It is nevertheless terrible to apply such experiments in a pedagogical way. If we can approach the child only by means of external experiments, this proves how completely estranged we have become from man's real being. Anyone inwardly connected with the child does not need external experiments. I wish, however, to emphasize once more that I am not opposed to experimental psychology. Yet we must acquire the faculty to enter man's being by the inward means of spirit and soul. For instance, we are told, quote, "A child's memory, his power of remembering, may be exerted too little or too much in his 9th or 10th year." Unquote. The clamor against over-exerting the memory can lead to the result of exerting it too little. We must always try to find the middle course. For instance, we may make too great demands on a 9 or 10-year-old's memory. The real consequences will not appear before the person in question has reached the age of 30 or 40, or perhaps still later. Then this person may develop rheumatism or diabetes. By over-exerting a child's memory at the wrong time, let us say between the 9th and 10th year, we cause during this youthful stage an exaggerated depositing of faulty metabolic products. These connections, lasting during a man's entire earth life, go generally unnoticed. On the other hand, by exercising the memory too little, that is, by letting a child's memory remain idle, we bring forth a tendency to all kinds of inflammations appearing in later years. What is important to know is the following, that the bodily states of a certain life period are the consequences of the soul and spirit states of another. Or let us mention something else. We make experiments as to how quickly 8, 9, or 10-year-old children in the grammar school tire during a reading lesson. We can work our graphs, which show that the pupils tire after a certain length of time when doing arithmetic, and again after a certain length of time when doing gymnastics. Then the lessons are arranged according to these charts. Of course, these charts are very interesting for purely objective science, to which I pay all due respect. I have no quarrel with such methods. But with regard to education, they are of no use whatsoever. For between the change of teeth and puberty, that is just at the grammar school age, we can educate and teach in the right way, only by not over-exerting either the head or the limbs, but by stressing the use of the respiratory and circulatory system, the rhythmical system. Above all, we should inject into gymnastic exercises rhythm and time beat. An element of art should be introduced. Hence the art of eurythmy is so well adapted to educational purposes. Here the artistic element enters into the child's movements. Similarly, we should relieve the child's head by keeping him away from too much thinking, but teach him instead in a pictorial, imaginative way, present things to the child pictorially. For then he is not made to exert either his nervous sensuous or his motor system, but mostly his rhythmic system, and this system does not become tired. You only need to consider that our hearts must beat all night long, even when we are tired and want to rest. We must ceaselessly breathe between our birth and death. It is only the motor and sensuous nervous systems that tire. The rhythmic system never tires. Therefore the child's schooling, at a time when he must take into his soul things of the greatest importance, should be organized in such a way that those of the child's faculties are called forth which never tire. If we calculate, however, that some subject exhausts the child in a stated period, and then employ charts of this kind, the educational methods are worked out in a wrong way, and not in a correct way. We must realize one thing. What experimental psychology makes clear is essentially the non-human. The human must be inwardly recognized. In this way, medicine too will be penetrated by thoughts pertaining to spirit and soul. In ancient times, medicine was dominated by such thoughts, and the activities of healing and educating were designated by the same word. When the human being entered the world, he was considered of being in need of healing. Education was tantamount to healing. This will again be possible once the knowledge given by spirit and soul will have advanced to a point where the deeper connections of these things can be discerned. As I said before, too little exertion of the memory causes subsequent inflammations. Too great exertion causes deposits of metabolic products. By looking at the effect of the action of spirit and soul on the physical, the spiritual element can be found in every single illness. And conversely, we learn to recognize the cosmos, to recognize the spiritual state of matter within the cosmos. Then therapy may be added to pathology. And here we are filled with the thought that since the mystery of Golgotha, we are obliged to appeal to the soul's inner essence. We can no longer draw the spirit-soul element out of our external surroundings. By considering in the lecture halls of anatomy merely the physical sensible, we shall call forth a cry such as was uttered during a recent medical congress. Impelled by the misery of the age, a medical scientist called out, "Give us corpses. Then we shall be able to advance in medicine. Give us corpses." Unquote. Certainly this cry is perfectly valid today, and again I do not fight against this demand for corpses. All this, however, can develop in the right way only if, on the other hand, the cry is uttered, quote, "Give us the possibility of looking into spirit and soul so that we may recognize how they continually build up the body and continually destroy it." Unquote. All this is connected with the right comprehension of the mystery of Golgotha. For the Christ wanted us to comprehend again how to heal out of our inner being. Because of this, he sent the healing Spirit. What he wanted to implant into mankind will bring us physical knowledge, but a physical knowledge permeated by the Spirit. Thus we comprehend the Christ correctly by grasping in the right way this word of the gospel, quote, "Whoever utters incessantly the cry, 'Lord, Lord,' or 'Christ, Christ,' should not therefore be considered a true Christian." Unquote. Anthroposophy is often reproached for speaking less of the Christ than does external religion. Then I often say to those who blame anthroposophy, quote, "Is there not an ancient commandment, recognized only also by Christians, but forgotten in this eternal mentioning of the Christ, quote, 'Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain,' unquote. This is one of the 10 Commandments," unquote. Whoever speaks ceaselessly of the Christ, whoever has the Christ's name constantly on his lips, sins against the sacredness of his name. Anthroposophy wants to be Christian in all it does and is. Therefore it cannot be reproached for speaking too little of the Christ. The consciousness that the Christ is living permeates everything brought forth by anthroposophy, and thus it does not want to have "Lord, Lord" incessantly on its lips. The less it speaks of the name Christ, the more truly does it desire to be Christian. The end of Lecture 6, at the end of the lecture cycle, by Rudolf Steiner, Man's Being, His Destiny, and World Evolution.